The wind was a constant, mournful companion on Jedediah Stone's ranch. It scoured the Montana plains, whispering through the sparse, winter-hardened grasses, rattling the loose panes of glass in the cabin window, and sighing under the eaves of the barn. For 11 years, Jedediah had known no other sound, save for the lowing of his cattle, the creak of saddle leather, and the rhythmic clang of his hammer against iron in the forge. Each sound, though, was merely a variation on the same theme: solitude. His hands, gnarled and powerful, moved with practiced efficiency as he stoked the embers in the hearth. Dawn was a bruised purple on the eastern horizon, promising another day of biting cold. The cabin was small, functional, and utterly devoid of warmth, both literally and figuratively, beyond the nascent fire. A single cot, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, one perpetually empty, and a collection of well-worn tools comprised his world. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and the faint, lingering scent of something untended, something forgotten. Jedediah, a man etched by the sun and carved by hardship, moved with the quiet, deliberate pace of a seasoned rancher. His face, tanned and lined, was a stoic mask. His eyes, the color of faded denim, held a distant, weary intelligence. He was a man who spoke only when necessary, and often, not even then. Words he'd learned carried weight, and sometimes that weight was too much to bear. He poured coffee into a tin mug, black and bitter, mirroring his own disposition. Each morning was a carbon copy of the last. Feed the horses, check the cattle, repair whatever the relentless elements had damaged, mend fences, chop wood. The cycle was endless, a self-imposed penance that kept the gnawing edges of his past at bay. His ranch, sprawling and isolated, was both his kingdom and his prison. Today, however, a subtle shift in the wind's song caught his attention. It wasn't just the usual howl. There was a higher-pitched whine, almost like a whimper carried on the gale. He paused his mug halfway to his lips and listened. The sound was faint, easily dismissed as a trick of the wind, but something in his gut tightened. 11 years of solitude had sharpened his senses, made him attuned to the slightest deviation from the norm. He finished his coffee, the bitter liquid burning a path down his throat, and pulled on his thick wool coat, worn gloves, and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen more suns and storms than he cared to count. Stepping out into the biting cold, the air immediately stung his exposed skin. Snow, a thin, icy blanket, coated the ground, sparkling treacherously in the nascent light. The whimper came again, clearer this time, undeniably human. It pulled at a chord deep within him, a chord he thought had been severed years ago. He followed the sound, his boots crunching on the frozen snow, his gaze sweeping the bleak landscape. Nothing. Just the endless plains stretching to the jagged silhouette of the distant mountains. Then he saw it, a dark, huddled mass against the weathered wood of his porch, barely visible against the shadow cast by the cabin. His hand instinctively went to the Colt, .45 holstered at his hip, a relic of a past he tried to forget. Bandits? Drifters? His mind raced through possibilities, each one a threat to his carefully constructed isolation. As he drew closer, the mass resolved into a figure, small and utterly still. His breath hitched. It was a person, or what was left of one. A girl. She was curled into a tight ball, her thin, threadbare clothes offering scant protection against the relentless cold. Her hair, matted with dirt and tangled, obscured most of her face, but a sliver of pallid skin and a single emaciated hand clutching at her chest were visible. He knelt, his movement stiff, wary. The girl was barely breathing, her chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged gasps. He reached out hesitantly and touched her shoulder. Her skin was icy cold, shocking beneath his rough glove. She stirred, a faint moan escaping her lips, and slowly, painfully, she lifted her head. Her eyes, when they met his, were wide and vacant, rimmed with dark circles, reflecting a terror and exhaustion that stole his breath. They were a startling blue, even in their glazed state, but devoid of any spark of life. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her face gaunt, her cheekbones sharply prominent. She looked like a ghost, a whisper of a person, barely clinging to this world. "Please," she rasped, her voice a dry, reedy sound, barely audible above the wind. "Please, sir, share your bread." The words, so simple, so ancient in their desperation, struck Jedediah like a physical blow. Share your bread. It was a plea that transcended language, a fundamental cry for survival. He stared at her, frozen, his mind struggling to process the image before him. A starving girl, a child almost at his doorstep. Here, now, the past, a dark, heavy shroud, threatened to descend. Memories of another time, another face, another cry for help he had been too late to answer, flashed behind his eyes. He squeezed them shut, trying to push the images away, but they clung, persistent as the dust of the plains. He opened his eyes, forcing himself to focus on the present. This wasn't the past. This was now. This was a living, breathing creature, on the verge of slipping away, asking for the most basic of human kindnesses. "Come on," he grunted, his voice rougher than he intended. He reached out not to touch her, but to motion towards the cabin. "Get inside. You'll freeze out here." The girl stared at him, bewildered, as if the concept of warmth and shelter was foreign to her. Then, with a monumental effort, she tried to push herself up. Her limbs trembled uncontrollably, and she collapsed back against the porch, a fresh, pained whimper escaping her. Jedediah cursed under his breath. He couldn't just leave her. He wouldn't. He knelt again, this time with a purpose. He reached under her arms, his hands surprisingly gentle as he lifted her. She was shockingly light, a bundle of brittle bones and ragged cloth. He felt the sharp edges of her ribs through her thin clothing, a stark testament to her prolonged starvation. He carried her into the cabin, the familiar scent of wood smoke suddenly feeling warmer, more inviting. He laid her gently on his cot, the only soft surface in the room. Her eyes fluttered open, still wide and fearful, but a flicker of something new, perhaps a nascent hope or simply relief from the cold, entered them. "Water," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. He nodded, already moving. He filled a tin cup from the bucket he kept by the stove, offering it to her. She clutched it with both hands, her fingers trembling, and brought it to her lips, drinking slowly, carefully, as if afraid it would vanish. Each swallow seemed an act of immense effort. As she drank, he studied her. She couldn't be more than 15, maybe 16, though malnourishment made it hard to tell. Her face, though skeletal, still held the delicate lines of youth. Where had she come from? Who was she? These questions swirled in his mind, but he knew they could wait. First, she needed to live. He rummaged in a small cupboard, pulling out a slab of dried venison and a loaf of day-old bread, tough but nourishing. He cut off a small piece of bread, softened it slightly with water, and offered it to her. She looked at the bread as if it were the most precious thing she had ever seen. Tears welled in her eyes, silent and slow, tracing clean paths down her grimy cheeks. She took the piece, her small hand trembling, and brought it to her mouth, chewing slowly, savoring each mouthful. It was a primal scene of survival, of life clinging to the edge. Jedediah watched her, a knot forming in his stomach. This girl, this stranger, had just shattered 11 years of carefully constructed solitude. His life, he knew with a chilling certainty, would never be the same. The weight of silence, once his burden, now felt profoundly different, redefined by the fragile presence of a starved girl who had simply asked to share his bread. And in that moment, he knew he couldn't turn her away. The morning light, now fully arrived, painted the cabin in a stark, unforgiving glow, revealing every speck of dust, every cobweb, and the full extent of the girl's emaciation. Jedediah sat on the floor opposite the cot, nursing another cup of coffee, watching her. She had finished the small piece of bread and was now sleeping, a deep, exhausted slumber. Her breathing was still shallow, but more even. He noticed the details he hadn't seen in the urgent grip of her rescue. Her clothes, though torn and filthy, were of a finer weave than what most homesteaders wore, suggesting a different past, perhaps a journey from a more settled life. A faint, almost imperceptible scar snaked from beneath her matted hair, disappearing into her hairline. Her boots, if they could still be called that, were split and worn through, offering no protection from the harsh terrain. Who was she? Where had she come from? The questions gnawed at him. The West was a vast, unforgiving place, but even here a lone girl, starving and desperate, was an anomaly. She couldn't have walked far in this condition. This implied something darker, something more immediate. He rose quietly, moving towards the stove to prepare a simple broth. He had dried vegetables and some leftover beef bones. It wasn't much, but it was nourishing. As he worked, he found himself recalling the last time he had cared for someone, truly cared for them. The memory was a dull ache, a ghost limb that throbbed with persistent pain. He pushed it away, focusing on the task at hand. This girl needed food, warmth, and time. Anything else was secondary. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. The girl stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. Her eyes, still wide with a lingering fear, darted around the small space, finally settling on Jedediah. He was seated at the table, sharpening a hunting knife, his back to her. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only sound. "Sir?" Her voice was a little stronger now, a fragile thread in the silence. Jedediah paused his work, turning slowly. "You awake?" It wasn't a question. She nodded, trying to push herself up, but a wave of dizziness evidently swept over her. She slumped back. "My head. It spins." "You've been starved," Jedediah stated plainly. "Take it slow. I've got some broth for you." He stood, pouring the warm, earthy-smelling liquid into a clean tin mug. He approached the cot, offering it to her. She took it with surprising strength, her hands still trembling but more controlled. She sipped it carefully, a faint sigh of relief escaping her lips. "Thank you," she murmured, her gaze lifting to meet his. "Truly, thank you." Jedediah merely grunted in response. He wasn't accustomed to thanks, nor did he know how to receive them. He returned to his sharpening, the rhythmic scrape providing a shield against the burgeoning intimacy of the moment. "My name is Ilara," she offered after a long silence, her voice soft. "Ilara Vance." Jedediah paused again, the knife still. "Jedediah Stone. Folks call me Jed." He didn't offer his hand. Physical contact was something he had long since abandoned. "Jed," she repeated, tasting the name. "It's a good name." Another silence descended, less awkward now, imbued with a nascent understanding. Ilara finished the broth, setting the mug carefully on the floor beside the cot. She still looked terribly weak, but a faint flush had returned to her cheeks. Where am I?" she asked, her blue eyes scanning the cabin once more. "My ranch," Jedediah replied, gesturing vaguely towards the window, "out on the plains, miles from anywhere." How did I get here?" Jedediah frowned. "You were at my porch, near frozen to death, don't you remember?" Ilara closed her eyes, a faint tremor running through her. "Flashes," she whispered. "Running. Cold. So much cold. And then darkness." She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "I remember asking for bread." "You did," he confirmed. "And now you've had it." He paused, a different kind of question forming on his lips. "Where's your family, Ilara? Where did you come from?" Her face, already pale, turned even whiter. Her eyes clouded over, a deep, profound sadness settling upon them. I don't have any family left. They're all gone." Her voice cracked, and she turned her head away, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Jedediah felt an unfamiliar pang in his chest. He wasn't good with tears, wasn't good with grief. He had buried his own too deep. He simply watched her, the silence now filled with her quiet weeping. After a few minutes, she managed to compose herself, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice hoarse. It's been a long time." "Nothing to be sorry for," Jedediah said, his voice softer than she'd heard it. He hadn't meant it to be, but it came out that way. He cleared his throat. "You need rest, more food. We'll talk later, when you're stronger." She nodded, too exhausted to protest. Her eyes began to droop, and soon she was asleep again, a small, fragile spark of life in the quiet cabin. Jedediah returned to his sharpening, but his mind was no longer on the knife. It was on Ilara. "All gone," she had said. The words resonated with him, a painful echo of his own past. He knew that feeling, that emptiness. It was a burden he carried every day. Now, it seemed, she carried it too. He looked at the girl, huddled on his cot, and a grim determination settled over him. He had brought her in. He had offered her bread. Now he wouldn't let her go. Not until she was strong, not until he knew she was safe. And perhaps, just perhaps, in helping her, he might find a sliver of peace for himself. The fragile spark of Ilara's life had ignited something within him, something he thought had been extinguished forever. It was a terrifying, exhilarating realization. His solitude, once a fortress, now felt like a cage, and the key had just walked in. Days bled into a week. Ilara's recovery was slow, agonizingly so, but steady. Jedediah, to his own surprise, found a nascent rhythm in caring for her. He would prepare small, frequent meals, thin gruel, more broth, eventually softened dried fruits, and a little venison. He changed her tattered clothes for a set of his own old patched shirts and trousers, too large for her but clean and warm. He tended to her few scrapes and bruises, her raw, chapped hands with a gruff, almost reluctant tenderness. The cabin, once a monument to his isolation, now held a different energy. Her presence, though quiet, was palpable. Her low coughs at night, the rustle of her turning on the cot, the soft clink of a spoon against a bowl. These sounds filled the silence, pushing back against the oppressive weight Jedediah had grown accustomed to. Ilara, for her part, remained cautious, observant. Her blue eyes, no longer glazed with starvation, were sharp, missing nothing. She watched Jedediah as he moved about the cabin, as he stoked the fire, as he prepared their meals. She saw the lines of sorrow etched around his eyes, the set of his jaw, the way he avoided direct eye contact. She sensed the invisible walls he had built around himself. One afternoon, as Jedediah mended a broken bridle by the fire, Ilara, stronger now, sat at the table, carefully mending a tear in one of his old shirts. "Jed?" she began, her voice still a little weak, but clearer. He grunted, his eyes focused on the leather. You've been very good to me. I don't know why. I don't know how I can ever repay you." He paused, lowering the bridle. He looked at her, truly looked at her. Her face still held a pallor, but some of the gauntness had receded. Her eyes, though still holding a shadow, had regained some of their youthful spark. "No need for repayment," he said gruffly. "Just get strong." "But why? Most men wouldn't. Not for a stranger." Her gaze was steady, searching. Jedediah looked away towards the flickering flames. "Just seemed right," he mumbled. A half-truth. The full truth was too painful, too close to the surface. It was the memory of another young face, one he had failed to save. Ilara sensed his reluctance, but she persisted gently. "You've been alone a long time, haven't you?" He didn't answer, merely tightened his grip on the bridle. "I can feel it," she continued, her voice soft. "The silence. It's heavy. I know what it's like, to be alone, to carry things that are too heavy for one person." Her words, so simple, so direct, struck a chord. He looked at her again, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. This girl, barely out of childhood, understood. "What do you carry, Ilara?" he asked, his voice low. It was the first time he had truly initiated a personal question since her arrival. She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the mending in her hands. "Too much," she whispered. "More than a girl should." She paused, then slowly began to speak, her voice trembling at first, then gaining a quiet strength. "My family, we were traveling west. My father, he was a teacher. My mother, she was kind. My little brother, he was only 5. Her voice hitched. "We were looking for a new life, a new beginning in California." Jedediah listened, his own work forgotten. The rhythm of her words, soft and sorrowful, filled the cabin. "We ran into trouble," she continued, her fingers clenching the fabric. "A gang. They called themselves the Vultures, or they were brutal. They took everything. Our wagon, our supplies, our lives." Her voice broke, a raw, ragged sound. I hid. My father pushed me under the wagon, told me not to make a sound. I watched. I heard everything." Jedediah's jaw tightened. He knew the Vultures. Their reputation for merciless brutality stretched across the territories. He had heard whispers of their increasing boldness, their terrorizing of isolated homesteads and lonely travelers. His blood ran cold. "I stayed hidden for a long time," Ilara went on, her eyes staring blankly at the wall, seeing things only she could see. "After they left, I waited, and then I crawled out. They were all gone, all of them." Fresh tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She was done crying, at least for now. "I buried them, as best I could, with my bare hands. And then I walked. I just walked. For days, I don't know how many, until I found your ranch." The silence that followed was different now. It was not the silence of solitude, but the heavy, suffocating silence of shared grief and unspeakable trauma. Jedediah felt a surge of cold fury, an old familiar anger that he thought he had buried deep. The Vultures. They were scum, the worst kind of vermin. He looked at Ilara, at the quiet strength in her eyes, despite the horror she had just recounted. You buried them, he repeated, his voice raspy. A girl, alone. You buried them. It was a statement of profound respect. She nodded. I had to. They deserved that much. And you walked all this way. I had nowhere else to go, nothing else to do. I just kept moving. I thought, if I stopped, I would die, or they would find me. Her eyes widened slightly. They might still be looking for survivors. They were thorough, they didn't leave witnesses. Jedediah's gaze sharpened. This was a new layer of danger, one he hadn't fully considered. If Ilara had seen their faces, if she could identify them, she was a liability to them, and a potential target. His ranch, once his sanctuary, now felt vulnerable. They won't find you here, he said, his voice firm, resolute. Not while I'm alive. Ilara looked at him, a flicker of something akin to hope and perhaps relief passing over her features. Why, Jed? Why do you care? He looked away again, his gaze finding the distant snow-capped peaks. Because no one deserves to be alone after something like that, he said, his voice barely a whisper. And because, he thought, he knew what it was like to be left alone, with nothing but memories and the crushing weight of loss. He knew what it was like to feel that there was no one left to care, and he wouldn't let that happen to her, not if he could help it. His own past, the reason for his 11 years of solitude, remained unspoken, but in Ilara's story, he saw a reflection of his own pain, a twisted mirror of shared tragedy. The shadows of her past had collided with the shadows of his, creating a dangerous yet compelling connection. His promise to protect her was not just born of compassion, but of an unspoken understanding, a silent pact forged in the crucible of loss. The ranch, once a place to hide, was now a place to defend. The revelation of Ilara's past hung heavy in the cabin, a silent pact between them. Jedediah, a man of few words, found himself even more withdrawn, but his actions spoke volumes. He moved with a renewed sense of purpose, his gaze constantly sweeping the horizon as he worked the ranch, his hand never far from his colt. He was no longer just maintaining his solitude, he was guarding it, and the fragile life now nestled within its walls. He taught Ilara the basics of ranch life, simple tasks that would help her regain strength and occupy her mind. She learned to feed the chickens, to gather eggs, to help sort dried beans and grains. Her initial awkwardness quickly gave way to a quiet determination. She was a quick study, her sharp mind eager to absorb knowledge, her hands capable despite their former weakness. One cold afternoon, Jedediah was repairing a fence post near the edge of his property. The wind whipped at his hat and the frozen ground resisted the bite of his shovel. Ilara, bundled in an old, oversized coat of Jed's, was nearby, collecting kindling for the evening fire. "Jed?" she called out, her voice barely carrying over the wind. He straightened up, leaning on his shovel, his eyes scanning the horizon out of habit before looking at her. "Yes? Will they really come here?" Her voice was laced with a fear she tried to hide. He walked over to her, his heavy boots crunching on the frozen earth. "They might, if they think you're still alive and saw their faces." He didn't sugarcoat it, he never did. "But if they do, they'll find me waiting." Ilara looked up at him, her blue eyes wide. You'd fight for me. I brought you in, Ilara," he said, his gaze hard, but not unkind. "You're under my roof now. That makes you my responsibility. No one comes onto my land and harms what's mine." The word mine felt strange on his tongue, a possessive declaration he hadn't uttered in years, certainly not about another living soul. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched Ilara's lips. It was the first genuine smile he had seen on her face, and it brought a faint warmth to the frigid air. "Thank you, Jed." He merely grunted, turning back to his fence post, but he felt it. A tiny crack in the emotional armor he had worn for so long. The unspoken promise had been made. As the days turned into weeks, a fragile routine formed between them. Jedediah's cabin, once silent, now held the quiet sounds of two lives coexisting. Ilara would read from a few tattered books Jedediah kept on a shelf, her soft voice a low hum in the evenings. Sometimes he'd listen, though he pretended not to, the stories a welcome distraction from the ghosts that often filled the quiet nights. One evening, after a particularly sparse supper, Ilara noticed Jedediah staring into the fire, his face a grim mask. "Jed," she began, her voice hesitant, "you told me you lost your family." He stiffened, his jaw tightening. That's old history. But it's not, is it? She pressed gently. Not if it still makes your eyes look like that. She gestured towards his face, like you're looking at something far away and it hurts. He sighed, a heavy, weary sound. He knew she wouldn't let it go. She had a way of seeing through his defenses, a quiet persistence that was both annoying and, surprisingly, a little comforting. My wife, he began, his voice rough, unused to speaking of such things. Sarah, and our son, Tommy. He was 6, full of life, loved horses. A faint, tender smile, fleeting as a winter butterfly, touched his lips, then vanished. What happened? Ilara asked, her voice soft, respectful of the pain she was witnessing. Jedediah stared at the flickering flames, watching them dance as if seeing the past within them. It was bandits, not the vultures, different lot, but just as mean. They came in the night, looking for gold, they said. We had nothing but this land, these cattle. He paused, a muscle twitching in his jaw. I fought them, but there were too many. They burned the house, took Sarah and Tommy, killed them both. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, a practiced shield against the overwhelming agony. I was left for dead. When I woke, they were gone. Everything was gone. Ilara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The horror of her own loss resonated with his. Oh, Jed, I'm so sorry. He shook his head, pushing himself up. No need. It was a long time ago. Doesn't change anything now. He turned away, walking to the window, staring out into the inky blackness. But Ilara knew it wasn't true. It changed everything. It explained his solitude, his gruff demeanor, the way he flinched at loud noises, the haunted look in his eyes. It explained why he had taken her in, a stranger, a child of loss. He saw his own tragedy reflected in her starved eyes, his own desolation in her desperate plea. They never caught them, she asked quietly. Some, not all. The leader, he got away, still out there somewhere probably, laughing. His voice was tight with a barely controlled rage. Ilara was silent for a moment, then she spoke, her voice clear and steady. You saved me, Jed. You gave me bread when I was starving. You gave me a home when I had none. You're not the man who was left for dead anymore. He turned from the window, looking at her, a flicker of something he couldn't quite name in his eyes. Hope? Acknowledgement? She was right in a way. He was still the same man, but something was shifting. Her presence had nudged him, however reluctantly, from the frozen stasis he had imposed upon himself. Get some sleep, Ilara, he said, his voice back to its usual gruff tone, but the edge of bitterness was softened almost imperceptibly. Long day tomorrow. She nodded, understanding the unspoken retreat. She climbed onto the cot, pulling the rough blanket up to her chin. But as she drifted off to sleep, she felt a profound sense of peace. She was no longer alone, and neither, she suspected, was Jed. The past, though a heavy burden, was now shared, and in that sharing, perhaps, lay the first steps towards healing. The unspoken promise was now not just about protection, but about shared survival, a quiet defiance against the shadows that still lingered. The Montana winter, though harsh, gradually began to relent. Days grew longer, the sun held more warmth, and the first tentative signs of spring green began to emerge beneath the melting snow. With the changing seasons came a gradual easing of Ilara's physical frailty. She moved with more energy. Her laughter, though rare and soft, was a welcome sound in the cabin. She was beginning to fill out, the sharp angles of her face softening, her blue eyes regaining their youthful sparkle. Jedediah observed these changes with a quiet satisfaction he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge. He found himself anticipating her small insights, her thoughtful questions. Her presence, once an intrusion, had become an essential part of his daily rhythm, a light against the encroaching darkness of his solitude. However, the easing of the weather also brought a new tension. With clearer trails and milder temperatures, travel became easier, and with it, the potential for unwelcome visitors. Jedediah's vigilance heightened. He spent more time riding the perimeter of his land, his senses alert for any sign of disturbance. One morning, as Jedediah rode back from checking his cattle, he noticed something amiss. A cluster of birds, normally content to peck at the winter-thinned grasses, scattered suddenly, flying off in a flurry of wings. He reined in his horse, Black, a sturdy dark stallion, and scanned the horizon. The air was still, save for the distant cry of a hawk, but a prickle of unease ran down his spine. He dismounted, walking slowly, his eyes trained on the ground. There, half hidden by a clump of sagebrush, was a faint set of tracks. Not animal tracks, human, and too fresh to be old. His jaw tightened. He followed them for a short distance, confirming his suspicion. 2 sets of boot prints, broad and worn, heading towards the main trail that led from his ranch. They hadn't come close to the cabin, but they had skirted the edge of his property. A scouting party? Or just drifters? He remounted Black, his mind racing. He had to assume the worst. The vultures. It was a possibility he had been dreading. He turned Black and galloped back to the ranch, the urgency a cold knot in his stomach. Ilara was in the cabin, humming a quiet tune as she kneaded dough for bread, a skill she had learned from Jedediah, one that filled the cabin with a comforting, homey scent. She looked up as Jedediah burst through the door, his face grim. "Jed, what's wrong?" Her voice was laced with immediate concern. "Tracks," he said, his voice low and tense. 2 of them, skirting the south range, headed towards the trail. Ilara's face paled, the color draining from her cheeks. The bread dough lay forgotten on the table. "The vultures!" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Jedediah nodded slowly. Could be anyone, but we can't take chances. You remember their faces?" She nodded, a faint tremor running through her. "Yes, I'll never forget them." "Good," he said, already moving towards his rifle, which hung above the fireplace. "Describe them to me. Any markings, scars, anything distinctive?" Ilara recounted what she remembered, her voice gaining strength as she focused on the details. The leader. He had a long, ugly scar across his left cheek from his eye to his jaw, and missing a front tooth. He was a big man, broad shoulders, cruel eyes. Jedediah listened intently, committing the description to memory. What about the other one? Smaller, wiry, shifty eyes. He had a tattoo on his right hand, a coiled snake, I think. Hard to see, it was dark. Jedediah loaded his rifle, the metallic click echoing in the cabin. "All right, we prepare, we lock down, you stay inside. Don't go near the windows. If they come, I'll be out there." Ilara walked over to him, her hand reaching out, tentatively touching his arm. "No, Jed, not alone. I can help. I can load for you. I can watch your back." Her voice was firm, resolute. The starved girl who had begged for bread was gone, replaced by a survivor, forged in hardship. He looked down at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He hadn't expected such defiance, such courage. But then he remembered her burying her family with her bare hands, walking for days across the unforgiving plains. She was no stranger to hardship. "You're not a fighter, Ilara," he said, trying to dissuade her. "I'm a survivor, Jed, and I'm not leaving you to face them alone. Not after everything you've done for me." Her gaze was steady, unwavering. "You said I'm under your roof, your responsibility. Well, you're my protector, and I won't stand by while you face danger. We're in this together." Jedediah stared at her for a long moment, then a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He knew she wouldn't back down, and perhaps he realized he didn't want her to. He had been alone for too long. "All right," he said, his voice gruff, "but you do exactly what I tell you. No heroics, understand?" "Understood," she replied, a faint smile touching her lips. He spent the rest of the day fortifying the cabin. He barred the windows with heavy planks, ensured the doors were reinforced, and checked his dwindling supply of ammunition. He taught Ilara how to load the spare rifle, how to check the chamber, how to hold it steady. Her fingers, though still slender, moved with a surprising aptitude. As dusk settled, painting the western sky in hues of fiery orange and deep violet, a tense silence descended upon the ranch. The wind still whispered, but now it seemed to carry a different message, a warning. Jedediah stood by the darkened window, his rifle cradled in his arms, his eyes scanning the gathering gloom. Ilara sat quietly at the table, a loaded pistol in her lap, her gaze fixed on the door. The whispers on the wind had taken on a new, ominous tone. The sanctuary of the ranch had been breached, not by an attack, but by the shadow of one. And Jedediah knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the fragile peace they had found was about to be shattered. The fight he had hoped to avoid, the confrontation with the brutal realities of the West was coming, and this time he wasn't fighting for himself, he was fighting for Ilara. Night fell, thick and heavy. swallowing the distant peaks and plunging Jedediah's ranch into an inky blackness. The air grew colder, and a thin, spectral mist began to creep across the plains, obscuring vision. Inside the cabin, a single lantern cast a flickering golden glow, creating dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. Jedediah stood at the reinforced front window, a narrow slit between the planks allowing him a limited view of the yard. His rifle was pressed against his shoulder, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of the old timbers, every distant hoot of an owl sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. Ilara sat huddled on the floor by the back wall, a loaded shotgun across her lap. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at the door, her senses hyper-alert. The fear was a cold, constant companion, but beneath it, a steely resolve had begun to form. She wouldn't be a victim again. She wouldn't freeze, wouldn't hide. She would fight. Hours crawled by, each minute stretching into an eternity. The silence inside the cabin was punctuated only by their ragged breathing and the soft, almost imperceptible crackle of the lantern wick. Jedediah knew the waiting was the hardest part. The anticipation, the dread of the unknown, was a heavy weight on the soul. "Jed?" Ilara whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is it?" he responded, not taking his eyes from the window. "How long do we wait? What if they don't come tonight? Then we wait till morning and we stay vigilant. They might just be scouting, trying to see if I'm alone. If they saw smoke, they know someone's here, but they don't know who." He paused. "And they don't know you're here." Ilara nodded, her grip tightening on the shotgun. The thought that she was the target, the reason for this impending danger, gnawed at her. "It's my fault, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice thick with guilt. Jedediah finally tore his gaze from the window, looking at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "No," he said, his voice firm. "It's the fault of men who prey on the innocent. You have no control over that, just like I had no control over what happened to my family." He walked over to her, kneeling beside her. "You survived, Ilara. That's not a fault. That's a strength." He placed a large, calloused hand on her shoulder, a rare gesture of comfort. She leaned into it, finding a moment's solace in his proximity. "But if they come—" "If they come," he interrupted, his voice steely, "they'll regret it. I promise you that." His words, imbued with a fierce conviction, momentarily dispelled some of her fear. She looked at him, truly seeing the unwavering resolve in his eyes, the silent power of a man who had lost everything but his will to protect. They fell back into silence, the waiting continuing its agonizing crawl. The mist outside had thickened, making the night even more impenetrable. Jedediah scanned the perimeter, straining his ears for any sound, any movement. Suddenly, a faint sound, a twig snapping. Not from the wind. Too distinct. Too close. Jedediah's body tensed. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely a breath. Ilara nodded, her eyes wide, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She gripped the shotgun, her knuckles white. "Stay down," Jedediah commanded, his voice low and urgent. He moved silently back to the window, pressing his eye to the slit. He waited, his breath held, every muscle coiled. The mist swirled, playing tricks on his vision. He saw movement, a shadow darker than the night, detaching itself from the deeper gloom near the barn. Then another. Two figures, just as the tracks had indicated. They were moving stealthily, taking advantage of the mist, heading towards the cabin. He recognized the gait, the predatory caution. These were not just drifters. These were men who knew how to stalk, how to approach unseen. "They're here," he whispered to Ilara, his voice devoid of emotion, a professional soldier preparing for battle. "Two of them, heading for the cabin, one's going around back." Ilara's breath hitched. She tightened her grip on the shotgun, her training with Jedediah flashing through her mind. Load, aim, fire. She repeated the mantra silently. Jedediah shifted, adjusting his rifle. He could take the one approaching the front, but the one at the back was a problem. "Ilara," he said, his voice sharp, "the back door. If he tries to break in, you fire. Don't hesitate. You understand?" "Yes, Jed," she replied, her voice shaky but firm. He waited until the figure at the front was close enough, a dark, hulking silhouette emerging from the mist. He could almost make out the crude features, the bulk of a man, likely the one with the scar she had described. He exhaled slowly, then fired. The roar of the rifle shattered the night, deafening in the confines of the cabin. A gasp of pain, a muffled curse, and the figure at the front collapsed with a thud. Jedediah immediately reloaded, his movements practiced and swift. "One down," he barked, his voice raw. "Watch the back." Before he could even reload fully, he heard a sickening splinter of wood from the back of the cabin. The back door, weaker than the front, was being forced open. "He's in!" Ilara cried out, her voice a mix of fear and desperation. Jedediah swore. He sprinted towards the back, his rifle now reloaded. He saw Ilara, shotgun raised, her body trembling, but her eyes fixed on the gaping hole where the door had been. A figure, smaller and wiry, just as Ilara had described, was halfway through the doorway, a pistol in his hand. He hadn't expected to be met by a shotgun. His eyes widened in surprise. "Stop!" Ilara yelled, her voice surprisingly strong. The man hesitated for a split second, then raised his pistol. Ilara didn't hesitate. She squeezed the trigger. The shotgun roared, a concussive blast that shook the cabin. The man screamed, a high-pitched agonizing sound, and crumpled to the floor, his pistol clattering away. Jedediah skidded to a halt, staring at Ilara, then at the fallen man. She had done it. She had fired, and she had hit him. Ilara, her face pale, her hands shaking violently, slowly lowered the shotgun. A wave of nausea washed over her. She had just taken a life. The reality of it was staggering, but she had also saved theirs. Jedediah walked over to the fallen man, checking him quickly. He was clearly out of the fight, bleeding heavily. He glanced at his hand, the coiled snake tattoo, just as Ilara had described. He looked at Ilara, a profound sense of pride and relief washing over him. She was no longer just the starved girl he had rescued. She was a survivor, a fighter. "You did good, Ilara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You did damn good." Ilara just nodded, unable to speak, her eyes still wide with the shock of what she had done. But the immediate danger had passed. The first wave had been repelled. The long watch of the night, however, was far from over. The whispers on the wind now carried the metallic scent of gunpowder and the grim knowledge that they were now truly in the fight for their lives. The echoes of the gunfire gradually faded, replaced by the chilling silence of the aftermath. Jedediah quickly secured the damaged back door as best he could, using a heavy table to barricade it. He then moved to the front, carefully peering through the slit in the planks. The figure he had shot lay motionless in the mist, a dark, unmoving heap. He turned to Ilara, who was still standing, shotgun clasped tightly, her eyes fixed on the man she had shot. Her face was streaked with dirt and tear tracks, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice softer now, laced with concern. She shook her head, unable to speak, her gaze still fixed on the body. The full weight of what she had done was settling upon her, a horrifying realization that she had taken a life. She had seen death before, witnessed it in its most brutal form, but this was different. This was her hand. Jedediah saw the shock, the burgeoning trauma in her eyes. He knew this feeling intimately. "It was self-defense, Ilara," he said, his voice firm, bringing her back to the present. "He would have killed us. You did what you had to do." She nodded slowly, still trembling. "I know, but—" She trailed off, the words unable to form. "There's no time for buts right now," Jedediah interrupted, his voice returning to its gruff, practical tone. "We need to check the perimeter. There might be more. The one I shot, he had a partner, remember? 2 sets of tracks." He retrieved a spare lantern, shielding its light as he cautiously opened the front door, just enough to slip out. "Stay inside. Keep watch. Don't open for anyone but me." Ilara watched him disappear into the mist, a new wave of fear washing over her. She was alone again, even if only for a few minutes. She held the shotgun tight, her eyes darting nervously around the cabin. She tried to focus on Jedediah's words. "You did what you had to do." It was a cold comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. Jedediah moved swiftly, his senses on high alert. He approached the fallen figure, checking him for life. The man was dead, a bullet clean through his chest. Jedediah recognized the scar Ilara had described, the long, ugly gash across the left cheek. The leader, one less to worry about. He then moved around the cabin, scanning the mist-shrouded yard. He found a second body near the barn, a smaller man, with a crude, makeshift bandage around his arm soaked with blood. The coiled snake tattoo was clearly visible on his right hand. This one was alive, but barely. His eyes fluttered open as Jedediah approached, filled with pain and hatred. "Where's your partner?" Jedediah demanded, his boot pressing lightly against the man's wounded arm. The man gasped in pain, refusing to speak. Jedediah pressed harder. "The vultures," he growled. "How many more of you are out there?" "Go to hell, old man," the bandit spat, blood flecking his lips. Jedediah sighed, a weary, resigned sound. He knew he wouldn't get answers. These men were loyal to their brutal cause. He pulled out his pistol, pressing the barrel against the bandit's temple. "Last chance," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "How many?" The bandit just stared at him, a defiant, hateful glare in his eyes. Jedediah squeezed the trigger. A single, muffled shot echoed in the mist, quickly swallowed by the night. He checked the perimeter one last time, ensuring there were no other lurking shadows. The ranch was clear for now. He dragged the two bodies away from the cabin, towards a shallow ravine behind the barn, where he would bury them at dawn. It was a grim, necessary task, one he had performed too many times in his life. He re-entered the cabin, the scent of gunpowder still lingering in the air. Elara looked up as he entered, her eyes searching his face. "All clear," he said, his voice flat. "Both of them. No one else out there tonight." Elara let out a shaky breath, slumping against the wall, the tension finally leaving her body in a wave of exhaustion. She dropped the shotgun with a clatter, covering her face with her hands. Jedediah sat beside her, offering her a cup of water. She drank it slowly, her hands still trembling. "It's over, Elara," he said, trying to offer reassurance. "For tonight, anyway." "It doesn't feel over," she whispered, her voice muffled. "It feels like it's just begun." He knew what she meant. The act of taking a life, even in self-defense, leaves a mark. It changes you. And for Elara, a young girl, it was a profound, traumatic event. He understood. He carried the marks of his own violence, his own losses. "It leaves scars," he admitted, his voice low. "But you faced it. You protected yourself. You survived. That's what matters." He placed his hand on her shoulder again, squeezing gently. "We'll get through this. Together." Elara looked up at him, her eyes still filled with a lingering horror, but also a nascent gratitude. She saw the grim determination in his face, the unspoken promise that he would continue to protect her, no matter the cost. They sat in silence for a long time, side by side, two survivors bound by shared trauma and an unexpected alliance. The initial threat had been neutralized, but the reckoning was far from over. The vultures were a large, ruthless gang. They would not forget this. They would not forgive. And Jedediah knew with a heavy heart that this was just the beginning of a larger, more dangerous conflict. His solitary life was well and truly shattered, and Elara, the starved girl who had simply asked for bread, was now at the heart of it. The dawn brought no true peace to the ranch, only the stark light of a new day revealing the grim reality of the previous night. Jedediah, after burying the two bandits in the ravine, returned to the cabin, his movements weary but resolute. Elara was still awake, huddled by the dying embers of the fire, her eyes hollow, her youthful vibrancy dimmed by the night's events. "You should try to get some sleep," Jedediah said, his voice rough with fatigue. Elara shook her head. "I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see his face." She shuddered. He understood. He'd seen faces too, faces that haunted his own sleepless nights for years. "It gets easier," he lied, knowing it never truly did, not completely. "You just learn to live with it." He busied himself making coffee, the routine a small anchor in the storm of their emotions. The cabin, normally a place of quiet contemplation for him, now felt charged with a different kind of energy, the raw aftermath of violence, the shared trauma that had forged a deeper, unspoken bond between them. "They'll be back, won't they?" Elara asked, her voice small. Jedediah poured 2 mugs of coffee, handing one to her. "Probably. They don't take kindly to losing men, especially their leader. They'll want revenge." A fresh wave of fear washed over Elara. "Then what do we do? We can't stay here, can we?" He sat opposite her, his gaze steady. "This is my home, Elara. My land. I'm not running from them, not again." The last word was barely a whisper, a stark admission of his past flight from his own demons. "We prepare, we fortify. We make it clear this isn't a place they can just walk into." But there's only 2 of us, she countered, the practicality of it hitting her. And they're a gang. You said they were brutal. And you're a good shot, Jedediah reminded her, a flicker of something akin to a grim smile touching his lips. And I know this land better than any of them. We'll use that. He took a long sip of his coffee. We won't go looking for a fight, but if they bring it here, we'll be ready. Over the next few days, Jedediah's resolve hardened into a plan. He began to transform his ranch from a simple home into a defensible outpost. He reinforced the outer walls of the cabin with heavy timber, turning windows into narrow firing slits. He built a makeshift palisade around the immediate vicinity of the house and barn, using logs and anything else he could scavenge. He dug shallow trenches, camouflaged with brush, at strategic points around the property, creating kill zones for any approaching attackers. Ilara, despite her lingering trauma, threw herself into the work with a fierce determination. She hauled stones, fetched water, mixed mud for chinking, and learned to load and clean multiple firearms. She also began to hone her marksmanship, practicing with Jedediah's spare rifle at targets he set up in a secluded gully. Her aim, surprisingly steady for a girl who had never fired a weapon until a few nights ago, steadily improved. She was learning to fight, not just for survival, but for a future she hadn't dared to dream of before. One afternoon, as they were reinforcing a section of the palisade, Jedediah paused, leaning on his axe. "You're getting good with that rifle," he observed, watching her take aim at a distant target. Ilara lowered the rifle, a small, wry smile on her face. "Never thought I'd be a marksman. But then, I never thought I'd be burying my family either." Her smile faded. "Seems life has a way of teaching you things you never wanted to know." "It does," Jedediah agreed, his gaze distant, "but it also teaches you what you're made of." He looked at her, a profound respect in his eyes. "You're made of strong stuff, Ilara. Stronger than most men I know." Her cheeks flushed slightly at the compliment. It was rare praise from Jedediah, and she cherished it. "I learned it from you, Jed, from watching you." He grunted, turning back to his work, but she saw the faint softening around his eyes. Their relationship, forged in the fires of shared hardship, was evolving into something deeper than mere protector and protected. It was a partnership. As the weeks passed, the ranch became a fortress, rudimentary but effective. Jedediah and Ilara lived in a state of heightened alert, always watchful, always prepared. The fear was still there, a constant hum beneath the surface, but it was now tempered by a hardened resolve. They were no longer victims waiting for the inevitable. They were defenders, ready to meet whatever came. One evening, as they shared a meal of stew by the fire, Jedediah looked at the reinforced cabin, at the palisade outside, at Ilara, her face still bearing the faint shadows of her past, but her eyes alight with a nascent strength. "This is our home, Ilara," he said, his voice quiet, almost reflective. "We'll defend it. Together." Ilara met his gaze, a fierce determination in her own eyes. "Together," she echoed. The word hung in the air, a silent vow, a powerful testament to the bond that had formed between the lonely rancher and the starved girl. They were ready. The vultures might come, but they would find no easy prey here. They would find 2 hardened souls, standing together, ready to fight for their lives, their home, and the fragile hope for a future that had somehow blossomed amidst the harsh realities of the unforgiving West. The reckoning was coming, and they were prepared to face it side by side. Spring had finally asserted itself, painting the Montana plains with vibrant greens and wild blossoms. The air was softer, carrying the scent of damp earth and new life. But for Jedediah and Ilara, the beauty of the season was overshadowed by a grim anticipation. The respite after the initial attack felt like the calm before a much larger storm. Jedediah's patrols grew longer, his vigilance more intense. One afternoon, while checking a distant fence line, Jedediah noticed something new: smoke, not from a controlled burn, nor a settler's distant fire. This was a dark, roiling plume rising from the direction of a small, isolated homestead about a day's ride north of his ranch. A bad sign, a very bad sign. He turned black and spurred him into a gallop, the horse's hooves thundering across the prairie. He returned to the ranch in a cloud of dust, his face grim. Ilara was tending to the small vegetable patch they had started, her face sun-kissed and streaked with dirt. She looked up as Jedediah dismounted, seeing the urgency in his eyes. "What is it, Jed?" she asked, her heart sinking. "Smoke," he said, his voice terse. "North, the Andersons' place. No good can come of that." The Andersons were a quiet, hard-working family who had settled in the region a few years prior, a beacon of simple, honest life. Ilara's face paled. The fear she had been trying to suppress resurfaced with brutal clarity. "The vultures?" Jedediah nodded grimly. "Likely. They're making their presence known, sending a message." He knew what kind of message it was. A warning, a display of their power, and a taste of the brutality they were capable of. It was a prelude. "We have to help them," Ilara said, her voice laced with desperation. "No," Jedediah replied firmly. "We can't. They're probably long gone. And if we ride in, we're riding into an ambush. We protect this place. That's our priority." His voice was hard, but Ilara could see the conflict in his eyes, the suppressed rage. He knew the cost of standing by, the agony of watching tragedy unfold. Ilara looked torn. Her compassion urged her to act, but her newfound pragmatism, learned from Jedediah, understood the logic of his decision. Still, the thought of the Andersons, innocent people suffering at the hands of the vultures, sickened her. "They're coming for us, Jed," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is just the start." "I know," he responded, his gaze sweeping the horizon. "This is them circling, testing the waters. They'll be here soon enough." They spent the rest of the day in a frenzy of final preparations. Jedediah checked all the fortifications, ensuring every plank was secure, every trench camouflaged. He sharpened his axe, cleaned his rifles, and carefully laid out their limited store of ammunition. Ilara helped him, her movements quick and efficient, her mind focused on the task at hand, pushing back the encroaching dread. As dusk settled, painting the sky with ominous streaks of red and purple, the wind began to pick up, carrying a faint, acrid scent of distant burning. The gathered storm was not just in the sky, but on the horizon, moving steadily towards them. Jedediah stood on the roof of the cabin, the vantage point offering him a broader view of the plains. He watched the last sliver of sun dip below the horizon, plunging the world into twilight. Ilara stood below, a loaded rifle in her hands, her eyes scanning the immediate vicinity. "Jed?" she called up to him. "Do you think they know we're ready?" He looked down at her, his face grim in the fading light. "They'll find out," he said, his voice flat but with an underlying steel. "They'll find out soon enough." The night that followed was different from the previous one. There was no immediate attack, no sudden burst of gunfire. Instead, it was a night of unsettling quiet, a palpable tension that hummed in the air. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every rustle of the wind sounded like approaching footsteps. The air was thick with anticipation. Jedediah maintained his watch from the roof, his eyes tirelessly scanning the darkened plains. Ilara took up her post by a fortified window inside the cabin, her shotgun ready. They spoke little, their communication often a shared glance, a subtle nod, an unspoken understanding. As the hours dragged on, the silence began to gnaw at Ilara's nerves. The waiting was a torment, worse than the actual fighting. Her mind replayed the images of her family, of the bandit she had shot, the fear a cold knot in her stomach. Jedediah, from his vantage point, saw something that made his blood run cold. Distant flickers of light, barely perceptible against the dark horizon. Campfires, several of them, spaced out, carefully hidden, but undeniably there. The vultures were not just passing through. They were setting up. They were preparing. He climbed down from the roof, entering the cabin with a quiet thud. Ilara looked at him, her eyes questioning. "They're out there," he said, his voice low and grave. "More than two. I saw their fires. They're making camp. They're not just scouting this time, Ilara. They're planning something big." Ilara swallowed hard, her hand instinctively going to the rifle beside her. The gathered storm had arrived. The full force of the vultures, a brutal gang with a vendetta, was now at their doorstep. Her past had not just caught up to her, it had dragged Jedediah into a conflict far larger and more dangerous than either of them could have imagined. The lonely ranch, once a sanctuary from a solitary past, was now the crucible where their shared future would be fought for, or lost. The long night of reckoning had truly begun. The first light of dawn, a pale, bruised grey, struggled to penetrate the thick mist that clung to the plains. Inside the fortified cabin, Jedediah and Ilara were grimly awake, their senses stretched taut, awaiting the inevitable. The distant campfires had vanished with the night, but the knowledge of their presence, of the gathered vultures, was a suffocating weight. Jedediah stood by the front firing slit, his rifle held steady, his eyes scanning the swirling white veil. Ilara was at her post by the back window, the shotgun cradled in her arms, her face a mask of determined fear. They had spoken little since Jedediah had seen the campfires. Words were useless now. Only action mattered. A faint sound, almost lost in the sigh of the wind, reached Jedediah's ears. A metallic clang, then another, closer this time. He stiffened. Horses, more than he had seen the night before. They were moving cautiously through the mist, their hooves muffled by the damp ground. "They're coming." Jedediah's voice was a low growl, barely audible. "More than we thought. They're spreading out." Ilara's grip tightened on the shotgun. Her breath hitched, but she held her ground. She remembered Jedediah's words, "Don't hesitate." Suddenly, a dark shape loomed out of the mist, directly in Jedediah's line of sight. A rider, hunched low on his horse, his rifle raised. Jedediah fired, the shot echoing like thunder, the sound muffled by the thick fog. The rider slumped forward, his horse rearing in panic before bolting back into the mist. "One down!" Jedediah barked, already reloading. Almost simultaneously, a frantic banging erupted from the back of the cabin. They were testing the reinforcement, pounding on the makeshift barricade. Ilara's heart leaped into her throat. "They're at the back!" she cried out. Jedediah cursed, sprinting towards the back of the cabin. He reached the reinforced door just as a heavy battering ram, wielded by two burly vultures, smashed against it. The timber groaned, splintering under the repeated blows. "Ilara, get ready!" Jedediah yelled, positioning himself to fire through a small gap he had created in the planks. Another rider emerged from the mist at the front, drawing Jedediah's attention. He fired again, the shot finding its mark. But before he could reload, a third rider appeared, flanking him, his rifle aimed. "Jed!" Ilara screamed from the back. Jedediah risked a quick glance. He couldn't fight them all at once. The back door was about to give way. He had to create a diversion. He turned, aiming his rifle towards the front, and fired wildly into the mist, forcing the flanking rider to duck. The distraction worked, but it cost him precious seconds. The back door splintered inwards with a deafening crack, revealing the snarling faces of two vultures, weapons raised. Ilara didn't hesitate. She raised the shotgun and fired. The blast ripped through the cabin, the defulous roar deafening. One of the attackers staggered back, clutching his chest, a look of shock on his face. The other, momentarily stunned, raised his rifle. Before he could fire, Jedediah, having quickly reloaded, appeared at the back, his own rifle spitting fire. The second vulture went down, but the assault wasn't over. More figures emerged from the mist, their shouts and curses filling the air. The vultures were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. They began to circle the cabin, firing sporadically, their bullets pinging off the reinforced walls and planks. Jedediah and Ilara worked in a deadly dance, reloading, firing, communicating with sharp, urgent commands. Jedediah, with his greater experience, took down those who got too close, who tried to breach the defenses. Ilara, her fear replaced by a cold, focused fury, provided covering fire, her aim surprisingly accurate. The mist, once their ally, was now their enemy, obscuring their targets, making every shot a gamble. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, the sharp tang of blood, and the frantic pounding of their own hearts. A bullet struck the front window slit, sending splinters of wood flying. Jedediah ducked just in time, his hat spinning off his head. Another bullet whizzed past Ilara's ear, embedding itself in the wall beside her. "They're trying to pin us down," Jedediah yelled, reloading his rifle with practiced speed. "They want to wear us out." The assault continued, a relentless barrage of gunfire and menacing shouts. The vultures, realizing a frontal assault was too costly, began to shift tactics. They started lobbing incendiary devices towards the cabin, rags soaked in oil, ignited and thrown with crude force. Jedediah saw one arc through the air, heading for the roof. "Fire!" he roared, pointing. Ilara, without hesitation, aimed her shotgun upwards and fired. The blast caught the flaming projectile in midair, sending it spinning harmlessly to the ground, a smoking heap of rags. They managed to fend off the initial barrage, but the attackers were regrouping. Jedediah knew they couldn't sustain this indefinitely. Their ammunition was limited, and the vultures seemed to have an endless supply of men. Suddenly a new sound cut through the din, the distinct roar of a powerful engine growing steadily louder. Jedediah froze, his eyes widening in disbelief. It couldn't be. Who would be coming out here, in the middle of a gunfight? The sound grew closer, a rumbling, mechanical beast emerging from the dissipating mist. It was a wagon, but not just any wagon. It was a large, heavy-duty wagon, pulled by a team of powerful draft horses, and driven by a figure Jedediah recognized with a shock of surprise. It was Silas Blackwood, a wealthy rancher from further south, a man known for his gruff demeanor and his even more legendary and often unpredictable philanthropy. He had a reputation for showing up when least expected, and always with a surprising force. Blackwood's wagon, its wheels churning through the muddy ground, barreled towards the vultures directly into the fray. He wasn't firing a rifle, he was wielding a whip, its lash cracking with a sharp, angry sound, aimed at the horses of the attacking riders. The vultures, caught completely off guard by this unexpected intervention, hesitated. Blackwood's wagon, a behemoth of wood and iron, was a formidable, albeit unconventional weapon. His powerful draft horses, trained for heavy work, charged through the attackers, scattering them, their massive hooves kicking up mud and fear. Jedediah, seizing the moment of chaos, shouted to Ilara, "Now, we push them back!" They both emerged from the cabin, rifles in hand, and began firing at the disoriented vultures. The element of surprise, coupled with Blackwood's audacious charge, was enough to break the attackers' resolve. The remaining vultures, seeing their numbers dwindling and their assault faltering, began to retreat, melting back into the mist, their curses and threats echoing in their wake. The assault was over. The immediate danger had passed, but the silence that descended was heavy with exhaustion, adrenaline, and the grim realization that this was only the first act in a much larger, more dangerous play. The vultures had been repelled, but they were not defeated, and Jedediah knew as he looked at Ilara, her face pale but her eyes blazing with a newfound strength, that their fight was far from over. The dawn, when it finally arrived, would bring not peace, but the grim knowledge that they had weathered the first storm, and the main tempest was yet to come. The mist, as if surrendering to the rising sun, began to dissipate, revealing the scene of devastation. The yard around the cabin was a mess of churned mud, splintered wood, and scattered debris. The air, thick with the lingering scent of gunpowder, now also carried the metallic tang of blood. 2 vultures lay dead outside the cabin, the victims of Jedediah's and Ilara's defense. More lay further out, casualties of Jedediah's initial shots and the chaos that ensued. Silas Blackwood, a man whose weathered face seemed carved from granite, stood beside his massive wagon, his whip coiled in his hand. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, surveyed the scene with a critical gaze. He was a man of imposing presence, not tall, but broad-shouldered and powerfully built, exuding an aura of quiet authority. His graying beard was neatly trimmed, and his plain, practical clothing spoke of a life lived in the saddle and in the elements. Jedediah, his rifle still in hand, approached him, his own exhaustion etched onto his face. "Silas," he said, a note of surprise and relief in his voice. "Didn't expect to see you out this way." Blackwood offered a curt nod. "Heard some trouble brewing from the south. Figured it was worth investigating. Saw the smoke from the Andersons' place yesterday. Figured someone else would be caught in the crossfire. Lucky for you, I have a soft spot for folks who stand their ground." His gaze swept over the fortified cabin, the scattered bodies. "Looks like you didn't need much help after all." "We had some," Jedediah admitted, glancing at Ilara, who had emerged from the cabin, her face streaked with grime and fatigue, but her posture defiant. "This young lady here put up a hell of a fight." Blackwood's eyes shifted to Ilara. He took in her youthful appearance, her stained clothes, the shotgun still clutched in her hands, and the unflinching resolve in her eyes. A flicker of surprise, then respect, crossed his weathered features. "Indeed, a spirited defense. You handled yourself well, miss." Ilara managed a small, shaky smile. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. You saved us." "Just a bit of timely intervention," Blackwood said with a gruff wave of his hand. "Those vultures won't be bothering you again anytime soon. They don't like losing men, and they certainly don't like being outmaneuvered by a wagon." He surveyed the dead bandits. "Though I suspect they'll be back. They're persistent, those rats." Jedediah nodded in agreement. They have a score to settle, with me and now with you. Let them come, Blackwood said, his voice firm. This is a free territory. No gang has the right to terrorize decent folk. He turned his attention to Jedediah. Jed, this is going to escalate. The vultures are getting bolder. They've been causing trouble all along the southern trails. If they think this place is an easy target, they'll keep coming. I know, Jedediah said, his jaw tightening. That's why we fortified. We're ready for them. Ready isn't always enough, Blackwood stated, his gaze serious. You need more hands, more supplies. I can bring more men from my ranch if you'd like, and provisions. We can set up a proper defense, not just rely on your cabin. Jedediah considered the offer. Silas Blackwood was a powerful man, and his ranch was well established. His help would be invaluable, but Jedediah had lived his life in isolation for a reason. He was wary of drawing attention, of inviting more people into his carefully constructed solitude. Yet the threat posed by the vultures was significant, far beyond what he and Ilara could handle alone. We appreciate the offer, Silas, Jedediah said, choosing his words carefully. But I've learned to rely on my own two hands and hers, he added, glancing at Ilara. Blackwood nodded, understanding Jedediah's reticence. I respect that, but this isn't just about you, Jed. It's about Ilara too. And it's about the other settlers in the area. If the vultures establish a stronghold here, no one will be safe. This isn't just your fight anymore. It's ours. Ilara stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. Mr. Blackwood is right, Jed. We can't fight them alone. Not if they bring their whole gang. We need help, and your help, Mr. Blackwood, would be a blessing. Jedediah looked at Ilara, at the conviction in her eyes. He saw not the terrified girl who had stumbled onto his doorstep, but a young woman who had faced down killers and survived. She was no longer the sole recipient of his protection. She was an equal partner in their survival. Her courage, her willingness to embrace the reality of their situation, swayed him. All right, Silas, Jedediah said, a reluctant sigh escaping him. We could use your help, and your men, but we do it my way. Fortify this place, make it a stronghold, and we wait for them. Blackwood smiled, a rare, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. That's the spirit, Jed. I'll have my men and supplies here by tomorrow evening. We'll make this place a thorn in those vultures' sides they won't soon forget. As Blackwood prepared to depart, he offered Jedediah a knowing look. Just remember, Jed, sometimes the strongest defense isn't just walls. It's the people you have beside you. Jedediah watched Blackwood's wagon rumble away, the sound fading into the vastness of the plains. He turned to Ilara, a complex mixture of apprehension and grudging hope in his heart. His solitary existence was over. The arrival of Silas Blackwood and the promise of reinforcements meant that his ranch was no longer just his refuge. It was becoming a battlefield, and the war against the vultures had just been declared. The arrival of Silas Blackwood's men the following evening was a sight Jedediah Stone had not witnessed in over a decade. A dozen burly, hardened ranch hands, armed and ready, descended upon his isolated property, transforming the quiet landscape into a hub of organized activity. Blackwood, with his quiet efficiency, directed the operation, his presence a calming yet firm force. Jedediah, though still wary of the influx of people, found himself grudgingly impressed by the professionalism and dedication of Blackwood's men. They worked tirelessly, under Blackwood's direction, to further fortify the ranch. They reinforced the palisade, making it a solid wall of timber several feet high, designed to deter any direct assault. New firing slits were added, offering wider fields of fire. Additional supplies, ammunition, preserved food, medical supplies, were brought in, transforming the small cabin into a well-stocked, albeit Spartan, fortress. Ilara, no longer a hesitant observer, worked alongside the men, her earlier bravery now tempered by a focused determination. She helped carry supplies, fetch water, and her knowledge of the cabin's layout proved invaluable in planning defensive positions. She and Jedediah worked closely with Blackwood, discussing strategies, potential vulture tactics, and identifying weak points in their defenses. "They won't come charging head-on again," Jedediah said one evening as they huddled around a low campfire, the sounds of construction echoing around them. "Not after losing 2 men and having their leader taken down. They'll try something else. Subterfuge, siege, or try to draw us out." Blackwood nodded, stirring the embers with a stick. "They're not fools, Jed. They'll learn from their mistakes, but they're also arrogant. They underestimate anyone who stands against them. That's their weakness. He looked at Ilara, who was sharpening a Bowie knife with meticulous care. And they certainly won't expect a young woman to be part of your defense. Ilara met Blackwood's gaze, a faint smile touching her lips. I've learned a lot from Jedediah, she said, her voice steady. He taught me that survival isn't about hiding. It's about fighting for what you have. Jedediah listened to their exchange, a flicker of pride in his chest. Ilara had grown so much in such a short time. She was no longer the broken girl who had arrived at his door. She was a survivor, a fighter, a vital part of their defense. As the days passed, a sense of cautious optimism began to bloom. The ranch, once a symbol of Jedediah's isolation, was now a bastion of shared defense. The men, a rough but loyal crew, moved with purpose, their presence a reassuring bulwark against the looming threat. Jedediah, who had actively shunned human company for over a decade, found himself not only tolerating their presence, but, in a way, appreciating it. The shared purpose, the common enemy, had forged a camaraderie he hadn't experienced since before the tragedy that had defined his life. One afternoon, Blackwood pointed towards a distant rise. We've established a lookout post up there. My men will rotate shifts, keep an eye on the approaches. If they see anything at all, they'll signal us. Jedediah nodded. Good. We need eyes out there. The mist won't always be our friend. The fortifications were nearing completion. The cabin, once a simple dwelling, was now a hardened structure, its windows barred, its doors reinforced. The palisade surrounded the main buildings, creating a defensible perimeter. Even the barn had been strengthened, its hayloft offering a vantage point for any defenders. Yet, despite the physical preparations, the psychological toll was evident. Ilara found herself jumpy, startled by the slightest sound. Jedediah, though outwardly stoic, spent hours staring at the horizon, his eyes hard and watchful. The vultures were out there, and they were patient. They would wait for their opportunity. One evening, as the men were finishing their work, Blackwood approached Jedediah. "Jed," he said, his voice low, "I've been doing some digging about your wife and son." Jedediah's gaze immediately sharpened, his body tensing. "What about them?" "The men who attacked you. I think I know who led them. A man named Cole, the Serpent Riley. He was a brutal sort known for his ruthlessness. He was part of a gang that was wiped out years ago, but some say he escaped. He's been rumored to be operating in these territories, gathering a new crew. The vultures are his." Jedediah's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he gripped a nearby fence post. Cole Riley. The name struck a chord, a dark echo from his past. He had heard whispers, but never concrete proof. If Riley was the leader, this was more than just a random attack. This was personal. "Riley," Jedediah repeated, the name a venomous hiss. "I'll see him burn." Blackwood placed a steadying hand on Jedediah's arm. "We will, Jed. But we need to be smart about it. We need to be ready. They know we're here now. They know we're prepared. They'll try to break us, to wear us down. We need to be ready for a siege." Ilara, overhearing the conversation, approached them, her eyes wide. "A siege? What does that mean?" "It means they'll try to cut us off," Jedediah explained, his gaze fixed on the distant, darkening horizon. "Cut off our supplies, our water, make us starve them out, or force us to come out into the open." A grim understanding dawned on Ilara's face. The fight for their lives was not going to be a quick skirmish. It was going to be a long, brutal test of endurance. The bulwark they had built was strong, but it would need to withstand more than just bullets. It would need to withstand the relentless pressure of a determined enemy, and the gnawing fear that came with waiting for the inevitable. The storm was gathering, and they had built their defenses, but the true test of their strength had yet to begin. The days that followed were a testament to the strained patience of war. The vultures made no further direct assaults. Instead, they became a constant, unsettling presence, a shadow lurking just beyond the visible horizon. Jedediah's lookouts, positioned on the distant rise, reported sightings of riders, always at a distance, always just out of reach, their movements designed to sow unease and demonstrate their omnipresent threat. Jedediah and Ilara, along with Blackwood's men, maintained their vigil within the fortified ranch. The routine was monotonous, yet critical. Sentries were doubled, patrols were kept short and highly cautious, and every member of the impromptu garrison was kept on high alert. The food supplies, while ample for now, were carefully rationed, a subtle reminder of the siege tactics Blackwood had warned of. The psychological pressure was immense. The vultures' strategy was simple yet effective: wear them down. They would appear at dawn, their dark silhouettes briefly visible against the pale sky, only to vanish like ghosts. They would circle the perimeter, their taunts and curses carried on the wind, designed to provoke a reaction, to draw Jedediah or Ilara out into the open. One afternoon, a lone rider, identifiable by the scar across his cheek, the man Ilara had shot and Jedediah had confirmed was dead, appeared at the edge of the property, just beyond the palisade. He stood there, a mocking smile on his face, holding up a crude banner made of tattered cloth. "You vultures are getting sloppy," Jedediah muttered, peering through a firing slit. "That's the second time one of your dead men has shown up." Ilara, standing beside him, felt a chill run down her spine. The man was undeniably the leader she had shot. How was he alive? Had she missed? Or was this some elaborate deception? The vultures, she realized, were masters of psychological warfare. The rider taunted them, his voice carrying on the wind. "Come out, Stone, come out and fight, show us what you're made of. Or are you just a coward hiding behind your walls?" Jedediah remained impassive, his gaze steady. "He's trying to draw you out, Ilara," he said, his voice calm. "Don't give him the satisfaction, he's just a ghost, a trick." Ilara nodded, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. She would not be tricked. She would not fall for their games. The rider continued his taunts for another 10 minutes before finally turning his horse and disappearing back into the vastness of the plains. The incident left them all unnerved. The vultures were not just an army, they were a cunning enemy, adept at playing mind games. Silas Blackwood, though his men were well drilled, recognized the strain the constant waiting was placing on everyone. He tried to keep spirits up, organizing card games in the evenings, telling stories of past exploits, his presence a calming influence. But even he couldn't entirely dispel the pervasive sense of unease. "They're trying to break us," Blackwood said to Jedediah one night, as they sat by the dwindling campfire, the men asleep in their makeshift barracks. "They want us to make a mistake, to lose our heads. That's when they'll strike, when we're tired and when we're desperate." Jedediah grunted in agreement, staring into the flames. "They won't break me. Not again." The pain of his past losses was a constant fuel for his determination. He would not be a victim again. Ilara, despite her fear, found a strange sort of strength in the routine. The days were filled with tasks: tending the small garden, reinforcing defenses, cleaning weapons, assisting with the meager rations. Her hands, once hesitant and trembling, now moved with a practiced efficiency. She was no longer the scared girl. She was a defender, a vital part of this small, beleaguered community. However, the constant vigilance took its toll. Sleep was fitful, punctuated by nightmares. Her mind, though outwardly focused, was a battlefield of its own, replaying the horrors she had witnessed. She found herself staring at Jedediah, at the lines of weariness etched around his eyes, the grim set of his jaw. She understood his pain, his struggle, and it made her own resolve stronger. They were in this together, two souls who had faced profound loss, now united against a common enemy. One particularly still afternoon, Ilara noticed Jedediah sitting by himself, staring out at the empty plains, his rifle resting across his lap. He looked lost in thought, his gaze distant. She approached him, a cup of fresh water in her hand. "Jed," she said softly. He turned, his eyes meeting hers. "Just thinking," he replied. "About what?" He hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "About how long it's been since I had to rely on anyone, since I let anyone in." He gestured vaguely to the men sleeping in the barn, to the reinforced cabin. "This is a lot." "It's necessary," Ilara said, handing him the water. "We can't do this alone, and we won't let them take this from us. Not again." The "again" hung in the air, a shared understanding of their past pains. Jedediah took a long drink of water, his gaze thoughtful. "You're right," he said finally, his voice softer than usual. "We won't. We stand together." He looked at her, a flicker of warmth in his faded denim eyes. "Thank you, Ilara, for staying, for fighting." She returned his gaze, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. "Thank you, Jed, for giving me a reason to." The waiting game continued, a relentless test of nerve and endurance. The vultures remained a phantom menace, their presence a constant gnawing pressure. But within the fortified walls of the ranch, a different kind of strength was growing, a resilience forged in shared hardship, a bond of mutual reliance that was slowly, surely, hardening into an unyielding resolve. They were waiting for the storm, but they were also preparing themselves, not just their defenses, but their very souls for the inevitable confrontation. The days of waiting began to wear thin. The vultures' persistent presence, their subtle psychological warfare was taking its toll. Ammunition, while carefully managed, was not infinite. The preserved food, though plentiful, was becoming monotonous. The constant state of alert was exhausting, leaving everyone on edge, their nerves frayed. Silas Blackwood, ever the pragmatist, called a meeting of Jedediah, Ilara, and his lead men. The flickering lamplight cast long shadows on their concerned faces as they gathered in the main room of the cabin, now a war room. "Our supplies are holding," Blackwood began, his voice calm but serious. "But if this drags on much longer, we'll be running low on ammunition, and our water barrels are starting to look a little thin. The vultures know that. They're counting on it." Jedediah nodded, his gaze fixed on a rough map of the surrounding territory spread across the table. "They're trying to starve us out, or force us to send out a scouting party for more supplies. That's when they'll strike. We can't afford to send anyone out there," Ilara said, her voice firm. "Not now, not when they're watching so closely. We saw their fires last night. They're out there waiting." One of Blackwood's men, a grizzled tracker named Macready, spoke up. "Boss, I've been studying their movements. They're not spread out as thin as they were the first night. They're consolidating, focusing their forces. I reckon they're planning a big push, soon." The news sent a fresh wave of anxiety through the small gathering. Jedediah felt a cold dread creep into his gut. He had faced attacks before, had lost loved ones to the violence of the West, but this felt different. This was a full-blown siege orchestrated by a cunning enemy. "We need to think about water," Jedediah said, his mind already racing. "The creek is our main source. If they cut it off or contaminate it, we're in serious trouble." Blackwood nodded. "Macready, can you assess the creek, see if there's any sign of sabotage, and can you find any other potential water sources nearby, even if they're a bit of a trek?" Macready saluted. "I can do that, Mr. Blackwood. I'll take 2 of the men. We'll be careful." The next few days were filled with an added layer of tension. While the constant vigilance against the vultures continued, Macready and his men made discreet forays to scout the creek and its surroundings. Jedediah and Ilara, along with the remaining men, maintained the defenses, their senses on high alert for any sign of movement from the enemy. Ilara, though still shaken by the violence, found a strange sense of purpose in these days. She helped organize the dwindling food supplies, managed the water rations, and continued her rifle practice with a grim determination. She had faced death, had taken a life, and now she was determined to protect the lives of those around her. On the 3rd day of Macready's scouting mission, he returned, his face grim. "The creek's still clear, Mr. Blackwood," he reported. "No sign of poisoning, but the vultures have patrols along its banks. Any attempt to draw water will be seen. And I found another source, a small spring about 3 miles east. It's hidden, but it's enough to supplement our needs if we can get to it without being seen." Blackwood considered the information. 3 miles was a considerable distance to travel, especially under enemy observation. "Getting water will be a risk," he stated. "We'll need to move at night, under cover of darkness." Jedediah agreed. "We'll need volunteers. And we'll need to create a diversion, draw their attention elsewhere at least for a few hours." The plan was risky but necessary. They couldn't afford to run out of water. Jedediah, with his intimate knowledge of the surrounding terrain, proposed a diversionary tactic. He would lead a small group on a feigned excursion towards the north, drawing the vultures' attention, while Blackwood, Macready, and a few others would attempt to reach the spring under the cover of darkness. Ilara, despite her own valuable skills in defense, was deemed essential to the cabin's security. Jedediah couldn't leave her vulnerable, and she was one of the best shots among them. Her task, along with the remaining men, was to hold the ranch, to defend it at all costs if the vultures decided to press their attack during the diversion. The night chosen for the operation was moonless, the darkness absolute. Jedediah, with Macready and 2 of Blackwood's most experienced men, slipped out of the fortified compound, moving silently into the night. Ilara watched them go, a knot of anxiety in her stomach. She knew the risks involved, not just for Jedediah and his men, but for herself and those left behind. The hours that followed were the longest she had ever experienced. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind or the distant cry of a coyote. Ilara and the remaining defenders sat by their posts, rifles loaded, eyes straining into the darkness. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound was amplified. The waiting game had entered a new, more desperate phase. The test of their resources and their courage had truly begun. The success or failure of Jedediah's diversion and Blackwood's water retrieval mission would determine their ability to withstand the siege that was surely coming. The plan was audacious, bordering on desperate. While Jedediah and his small team moved north, creating a visible albeit brief disturbance to draw the vultures' attention, Blackwood, Macready, and a handful of his most trusted men would attempt to reach the hidden spring 3 miles to the east, under the cloak of the moonless night. Ilara and the remaining defenders were tasked with holding the ranch, a seemingly impossible feat against an enemy that vastly outnumbered them. Jedediah's diversion began as planned. They rode hard, making as much noise as they dared, creating the illusion of a large group venturing out, possibly seeking supplies or reinforcements. They fired a few shots into the air, deliberately drawing attention to themselves, then melted back into the darkness, doubling back towards the ranch, hoping they had bought Blackwood enough time. Back at the ranch, the wait was agonizing. Ilara, positioned at the main firing slit, felt the gnawing fear of isolation. The vultures, she knew, would be watching, waiting for any sign of weakness. The absence of their usual taunts was more unnerving than their presence. It felt like the calm before a destructive storm. The minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. The silence was a heavy blanket, amplifying every small sound. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, her muscles coiled, ready for action. She replayed Jedediah's instructions, his calm demeanor, his unwavering trust in her. She had to be strong. For him, for all of them. Suddenly, a faint sound broke the oppressive stillness, not the whisper of wind, nor the rustle of leaves. It was the faint, rhythmic clink of metal on metal carried on the night air. It was the sound of horses moving cautiously, their riders trying to remain undetected. "They're coming," Ilara whispered, her voice barely audible. Her hand tightened on the rifle. The sounds grew louder, closer. Jedediah's diversion had not been as effective as hoped, or perhaps the vultures had split their forces, anticipating a move. Shadows began to coalesce in the darkness, figures emerging from the gloom, their weapons glinting faintly in the starlight. "They're here," Ilara called out, her voice ringing with urgency. "Multiple attackers, at the north and west perimeters." The remaining defenders, a small but determined group, scrambled to their positions. The vultures, using the darkness to their advantage, began to press their assault. Bullets pinged off the reinforced walls, a deadly prelude to the onslaught. Inside the cabin, Ilara fired through the slit, aiming for the fleeting glimpses of movement in the darkness. She felt a surge of adrenaline, her fear momentarily pushed aside by the primal instinct to survive. She saw a figure stumble and fall, heard a muffled curse, and a flicker of grim satisfaction shot through her. The vultures, however, were relentless. They began to probe the defenses, testing weak points, their numbers a constant menacing pressure. They weren't launching a full-scale frontal assault, but rather a series of probing attacks, designed to wear down the defenders, to expose any vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, 3 miles to the east, Blackwood, Macready, and their men moved with agonizing slowness towards the hidden spring. The darkness was their ally, but the fear of discovery was a palpable presence. Every snap of a twig, every distant hoot of an owl, sent a jolt of apprehension through them. They reached the spring, a small, hidden trickle of water nestled in a rocky ravine. The relief was immense but short-lived. As Macready began to fill the water barrels, a sudden glint of moonlight on metal caught his eye. Figures, silhouetted against the faint light on a ridge above them. "Ambush!" Macready hissed, drawing his pistol. The vultures, alerted to their presence, opened fire. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks, forcing Blackwood and his men to take cover. They were trapped, exposed, with precious little cover. "Get the water! We need to get the water back!" Blackwood yelled, his voice strained. A desperate struggle ensued. The vultures, determined to deny them their vital resource, pressed their attack. Macready and his men fought back, their shots echoing in the narrow ravine. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and exposed. Back at the ranch, the vultures' probing attacks intensified. Jedediah and his men, having doubled back, were now engaged in a desperate defense. The sounds of gunfire from the east, though faint, reached them, a grim reminder of the two fronts they were fighting on. "They found them," Jedediah muttered, reloading his rifle, his face grim. "Blackwood's men. They're caught." Ilara heard him, her heart sinking. The water was crucial. Without it, their defenses would eventually crumble. The drought, both literal and metaphorical, had begun. The waiting game had turned into a brutal fight for survival, and the odds were stacking against them. The test of their resources had become a test of their endurance, their courage, and their very will to survive. The skirmish at the spring was a brutal affair. Macready and his men fought valiantly, but the vultures, alerted to their presence and intent, were determined to prevent them from returning with any water. Bullets whizzed through the ravine, ricocheting off rocks, forcing Blackwood and his small contingent to take cover. "We have to get some of these barrels back," Blackwood shouted over the din of gunfire, his voice strained. Even a few would make a difference. Macready, bleeding from a shallow graze on his arm, nodded grimly. "I'll try to create a diversion, Mr. Blackwood. You and the others grab what you can and get out of here. Move fast, don't look back." Before Blackwood could protest, Macready, with a fierce yell, burst from cover, firing his pistol wildly at the vultures on the ridge, drawing their fire. It was a suicidal charge, a sacrifice meant to buy precious time. Blackwood, his face etched with grim resignation, yelled to his remaining men, "Grab the water! Go! Now!" They scrambled, their movements frantic, grabbing as many filled barrels as they could carry, their boots slipping on the wet rocks. The sounds of Macready's desperate fight faded behind them as they fled back into the darkness. The precious water their only cargo. The vultures, their attention now focused on Macready's sacrifice, had momentarily lost sight of Blackwood and his men. Back at the ranch, Ilara and the defenders fought a desperate battle. The vultures, sensing a potential shift in their favor, were pressing their attacks with renewed ferocity. Jedediah, leading the defense, found himself stretched thin, trying to shore up weak points, direct his small force, and return fire. "They're trying to break through the west wall," a defender yelled, his voice strained. Jedediah cursed, reloading his rifle. "Ilara, can you get to the west flank? We need everything we've got." Ilara didn't hesitate. She dropped the rifle she was using and grabbed the shotgun, sprinting towards the west wall. The sounds of splintering wood and angry shouts filled the air. She saw two vultures, their faces contorted in rage, trying to force their way through a weakened section of the palisade. She raised the shotgun, aiming carefully. She squeezed the trigger, the familiar roar echoing in the night. One vulture staggered back, clutching his shoulder. The other hesitated, momentarily stunned. It was enough. Jedediah appeared, his rifle spitting fire, and the second attacker fell. "Good work, Ilara," Jedediah yelled, his voice hoarse. "Hold the line." But the vultures were persistent. They kept up their barrage, their attacks relentless. Jedediah knew they couldn't sustain this for much longer. Their ammunition was running low and the constant fighting was exhausting. Just as despair began to creep in, Jedediah heard a faint sound in the distance, carried on the wind. It was the rumble of wagon wheels, and with it the unmistakable sound of horses, moving at a steady pace, not the furtive movements of attackers, but the purposeful gait of those returning. "Silas!" Jedediah roared, a surge of relief washing over him. "They're back!" The vultures, hearing the approaching wagons and sensing a potential shift in the balance, hesitated. Their attacks faltered, their momentum broken. Jedediah pressed his advantage, urging his men to keep up the pressure, to make them think twice about continuing their assault. Blackwood's wagons, carrying their precious cargo of water, rumbled into the compound, their headlights cutting through the darkness. The arrival of reinforcements, even a small group, bolstered the defenders' spirits. The vultures, realizing their advantage was lost, and their element of surprise diminished, began to withdraw, their frustrated shouts echoing in the night. The assault ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a scene of chaos and exhaustion. The defenders, battered and weary, stumbled out of their positions, their faces grim but triumphant. They had held. They had survived. Jedediah found Ilara by the west wall, her face smudged with dirt and sweat, her eyes wide with residual fear, but also with a fierce, unwavering resolve. He looked at her, a profound sense of pride swelling in his chest. She had faced down death, had fought with courage and skill, and had held the line. "You did good, Ilara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You did real good." She met his gaze, a weary smile touching her lips. "We all did, Jed. We held." Blackwood, his face grim but his eyes alight with relief, approached them. "We lost Macready," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow, "and 2 of my men. They fought bravely, bought us the time we needed." Jedediah nodded, his own grief for the fallen mingling with the grim satisfaction of survival. "They won't be forgotten. They died defending this place, defending all of us." The immediate threat had passed, but the cost had been steep. They had secured their water, but at the price of lives. The vultures had been repelled, but they had not been defeated, and Jedediah knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that this was just the beginning. The fight for the ranch, for their lives, was far from over. The drought had been averted, but the drought of peace, the drought of safety, was far from ended. The dawn after the vultures' assault brought a somber mood to the ranch. The celebratory relief of surviving the night was tempered by the heavy cost. The bodies of Macready and 2 of Blackwood's men lay in the barn, covered by rough blankets, a silent testament to the brutal reality of their conflict. The vultures had retreated, but their departure was not a victory, merely a temporary respite. Jedediah, his face etched with exhaustion and a grim determination, surveyed the damage. The palisade bore fresh bullet holes, the cabin walls were scarred, and the ground was churned mud, littered with spent cartridges and debris. The vultures had inflicted damage, but they had failed to break the ranch's defenses. Silas Blackwood, his usual stoicism replaced by a profound sadness, stood beside Jedediah, his gaze fixed on the barn. "They paid a heavy price for their bravery," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Macready was a good man, loyal. He knew the risks, but he believed in this cause." Ilara, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep and the lingering shock of the night's events, approached them. She looked at the barn, at the covered bodies, and a wave of grief washed over her. She had seen death, had participated in it, but the loss of these men, who had come to their aid, felt particularly poignant. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jedediah looked at her, then at Blackwood. "We bury our dead with honor, then we regroup, we assess our situation, and we prepare for the next assault." His voice was steady, unwavering, despite the weariness in his eyes. The burial was a somber, solemn affair. Under the pale morning sky, Jedediah, Blackwood, Ilara, and the remaining men gathered in a small, untouched clearing a short distance from the ranch. Jedediah, drawing on a deep well of past experience, officiated the ceremony, his words simple, heartfelt, and imbued with a quiet dignity. He spoke of courage, of sacrifice, and of the enduring bond that had formed between them. As he spoke, Ilara looked at Jedediah, at the strength he possessed, the quiet resilience that had always been a part of him, now amplified by the shared ordeal. She saw the pain in his eyes, but also a flicker of something new, a hardened resolve, a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just protecting his own solitude. He was fighting for a future, for the lives of those who had chosen to stand with him. After the burial, they returned to the ranch, the mood heavy but resolute. Blackwood, ever practical, began to take stock of their remaining resources. Ammunition was critically low. The water supply, though replenished, would need careful management. Food, while not yet a dire concern, would become an issue if the siege continued much longer. "We can't last indefinitely on what we have," Blackwood stated, his voice grave. "The vultures know that. They'll try to wear us down, starve us out, or force us to make a desperate move." Jedediah paced the main room of the cabin, his mind working furiously. "They won't break us," he said, his voice firm. "We've held them off once. We can do it again. But we need to think. They're out there, watching. They won't expect us to make a move. Not now." Ilara, listening to their conversation, felt a familiar surge of fear, but it was now tempered by a growing sense of agency. She was no longer just a victim. She was a defender. "What if we try to get more supplies?" she ventured, her voice hesitant. "Jed, you know the land better than anyone. If you and Mr. Blackwood could make a quick run while the others hold the ranch." Jedediah shook his head. "Too risky. They'll be watching the trails. They know we need supplies. They'll be waiting." Blackwood considered Ilara's suggestion. She's right, Jed. We can't just sit here and wait to run out of everything. But you're also right about the risk. We need to be clever. We need to be fast. He looked at Jedediah. What if we used the wagons? Load them with what little we have, make a show of leaving, heading west, draw their attention. Then, at a specific point, we split. You and Ilara, with a few of my men, take a different route, a covert one, to the old abandoned trading post. It's a risk, but it might be our only chance to get what we need. Jedediah considered the plan. It was fraught with danger. But it was also a bold move, a way to strike back, to reclaim some initiative. He looked at Ilara, at the unwavering determination in her eyes. She was ready for it. He was ready for it. It's a long shot, Silas, Jedediah said slowly, but it might be our only shot. Then we take it, Blackwood replied, his gaze steady. We have to. The cost of survival was high. They had lost good men, and their resources were dwindling. But in the face of overwhelming odds, a new resolve had taken root. They would not be broken. They would fight, and if necessary, they would risk everything for a chance at survival, for a chance at a future. The cost was immense, but the will to endure, to fight back, was even greater. The plan was set, born of desperation and forged in the crucible of their current predicament. Silas Blackwood, ever the strategist, had devised a risky gambit, a feigned departure from the ranch, intended to draw the vultures' attention, followed by a covert mission to the abandoned trading post for vital supplies. Jedediah, Ilara, and a small contingent of Blackwood's most seasoned men would undertake the dangerous mission, while the remaining defenders, led by Blackwood himself, would hold the ranch. The morning dawned, a tense, overcast affair. Jedediah and Ilara, along with Macready, whose wound, though still bandaged, had healed enough for him to ride, and two of Blackwood's other men, Jake and Finn, prepared for their departure. They loaded a single, smaller wagon with provisions, making it look as though they were abandoning the ranch entirely. Jedediah, his face set in grim determination, knew this was their best chance, but also their most dangerous. Blackwood, his expression grave, clasped Jedediah's shoulder. "Keep your wits about you, Jed. These vultures are cunning. Don't underestimate them. And Ilara," he turned to her, his gaze serious, "you're as good as any man out there. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Protect this mission. Protect yourselves." Ilara met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a steely resolve. "We will, Mr. Blackwood. We won't let you down." As the sun climbed higher, Jedediah, Ilara, Macready, Jake, and Finn hitched the horses to the wagon and began their slow, deliberate journey west, away from the ranch. They made sure to be visible, their movements designed to attract attention. Jedediah fired his rifle into the air a few times, a deliberate signal to any vultures lurking nearby. From their vantage point on the ridge overlooking the ranch, Blackwood and his men watched them go. Blackwood's face was a mask of stoicism, but a flicker of apprehension crossed his eyes. He knew the risks Jedediah and Ilara were taking. "They're leaving," one of Blackwood's men observed, his voice low. "Let them go," Blackwood replied, his gaze fixed on the departing wagon. "They're buying us time. Now we prepare. They'll be watching us. They'll assume we're just waiting here, licking our wounds. Let them think that." Meanwhile, Jedediah's small group had traveled for an hour, making sure they were well within the vultures' likely observation range. At a prearranged point, a dense thicket of trees Jedediah knew intimately, they veered off the main trail, disappearing into the undergrowth. Their true objective lay to the east towards the abandoned trading post. The journey to the trading post was arduous and tense. They moved as quietly as possible, relying on Jedediah's knowledge of the land to avoid any patrols. The abandoned post was a dilapidated structure, barely more than a collection of rotting timbers and a collapsed roof. It was hardly a treasure trove, but Jedediah remembered it being used as a small supply depot by a fur trapper years ago. There might be something left. They reached the trading post as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The silence was profound, broken only by the wind whistling through the broken timbers. They cautiously entered the dilapidated building, their rifles at the ready. The interior was dark and dusty, filled with cobwebs and the lingering scent of decay. Jedediah moved with practiced stealth, his eyes scanning every shadow. Jake and Finn began to search the remnants of the structure, while Macready, his arm throbbing, kept watch at the entrance. "Anything?" Ilara whispered, her voice echoing in the stillness. Jedediah shook his head, his gaze sweeping over the debris. "Not much. Some rusted tools, a few empty barrels, nothing useful." Just as disappointment began to set in, Jake let out a cry. "Jed, over here!" Jedediah rushed to where Jake was standing, near a collapsed section of the wall. Hidden beneath a pile of rotted canvas, they found a small, sturdy wooden chest. It was heavy. Jedediah and Jake strained to lift it, revealing its contents. Inside, carefully packed and preserved, were several sacks of flour, a small but significant amount of dried meat, a collection of rifle cartridges, and most importantly, several large sealed containers of powder. It wasn't a king's ransom, but for their besieged ranch, it was a lifeline. "This is it," Jedediah said, his voice filled with relief. "This will keep us going. This might be enough." As they began to load the supplies onto their wagon, a chilling sound reached their ears. The distant but distinct baying of hounds. Jedediah's blood ran cold. Dogs. The vultures must have found their trail. They had been followed. "They found us," McCready breathed, his hand instinctively going to his pistol. "We're exposed." Jedediah looked at the supplies, then at the entrance. The sound of the hounds grew louder, closer. The calculated risk had turned into a desperate gamble. They had the supplies, but now they had to get them back to the ranch, and they were walking into a trap. The gathered storm, it seemed, was about to break. The silence that descended after the last vulture had fallen was not the peaceful quiet of a resolved conflict, but the heavy, oppressive stillness of a battlefield. Jedediah moved with grim efficiency, his movements honed by years of dealing with the harsh realities of ranch life, now amplified by the recent carnage. Ilara, though physically unharmed, was visibly shaken. Her hand still bore the tremors of the ordeal, and her eyes, once bright with newfound strength, now held a haunted, distant look. Jedediah surveyed the scene. The yard was a tableau of chaos. Bullet holes marred the cabin walls and the palisade. Scattered across the ground were the bodies of the vultures, a grim testament to their failed assault. His own small defenses, built with desperate urgency, had held. But the cost was etched onto the very landscape of his home. "We need to clean this up," Jedediah said, his voice raspy, his gaze sweeping over the fallen men. "Before the scavengers arrive, or before any more of them show up." Ilara nodded, her throat tight. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the fight was draining away, leaving her weak and trembling. The reality of what had happened, of the lives she had taken, was beginning to sink in. I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I can't look at them." Jedediah approached her, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he placed them on her shoulders. "I know," he said softly, "but we have to. We can't let them lie here. It's not right, and it won't do us any good." He looked into her eyes, his own reflecting a deep, weary understanding. "You did what you had to do, Ilara. We both did. Now we clean up the mess." He began the grim work, dragging the bodies to the ravine where the others lay. Ilara, after a moment's hesitation, forced herself to follow, her stomach churning, her mind numb. She focused on Jedediah's back, on the methodical way he moved, on the steady rhythm of his work. She tried to block out the sight and smell, concentrating on the sheer necessity of the task. As they worked, a chilling realization began to dawn on Jedediah. The vultures had been well-armed, numerous, and clearly determined. Their attack had been fierce, relentless. Yet they had been repelled, and not just by Jedediah's defenses, but by a coordinated effort. Ilara's unwavering aim, her courage under fire, had been crucial. You were magnificent, Ilara," Jedediah said, his voice gruff, as they finished burying the last of the bodies. It was a rare, heartfelt compliment, and it seemed to surprise even him. Ilara offered a weak, tremulous smile. "I was scared, Jed, terrified, but I remembered what you taught me, and I remembered why I was fighting." She looked at him, her blue eyes, though still shadowed, holding a newfound glint of resilience. "I wasn't going to let them win, not after they took everything from me, not after you gave me a reason to fight." Jedediah met her gaze, a flicker of something akin to pride in his faded blue eyes. He saw not just the young woman he had rescued from the brink of death, but a survivor, forged in the crucible of conflict. The girl who had stumbled onto his doorstep begging for bread was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had faced her deepest fears and emerged, not unscathed but unbroken. As they returned to the cabin, the rising sun cast long shadows across the ravaged landscape. The damage was significant. The palisade was torn, the cabin walls bore deep gouges, and several of the outer structures were partially collapsed. But the core of the ranch, the cabin itself, stood strong, and more importantly, they stood strong. "We need to rebuild," Jedediah stated, his gaze sweeping over the destruction. "And we need to move the cattle. They know we're here now. They'll be back, and they'll be angrier." Ilara nodded, her mind already racing with practicalities. "How many cattle did we lose?" Jedediah shook his head. "Hard to say yet, but I saw some of them spooked and running during the fight. We need to round them up." The work of rebuilding and regrouping was arduous. Jedediah and Ilara worked side by side, their movements efficient and synchronized. Jedediah, with his years of experience, directed the repairs, his gruff commands softened by a growing respect for Ilara's capabilities. Ilara, in turn, took on more responsibility, her innate resourcefulness and quick learning proving invaluable. She patched clothes, mended tack, and even managed to salvage some of their dwindling food supplies. During their work, a subtle shift occurred between them. The dynamic of protector and protected was still present, but it was now overlaid with a deeper layer of partnership. They were equals, bound by the shared ordeal and the common goal of survival. Jedediah found himself confiding in Ilara more, sharing snippets of his past, not the full raw pain, but enough to explain his solitude, his vigilance. Ilara, in turn, spoke more openly about her family, her lost dreams, the gnawing emptiness that still lingered. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the cabin a little warmer, a little more secure than before, Ilara asked, "Jed, why do you think they came here specifically? It wasn't just a random attack, was it?" Jedediah stirred the embers with a poker, his gaze thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that. The vultures are a large gang. They don't usually hit isolated ranches like mine unless there's a reason, unless they were looking for something or someone." He looked at her, his expression serious. "Maybe they were looking for you, Ilara. Maybe they heard about a lone girl traveling west, a survivor, and they came to finish the job." Ilara's breath caught in her throat. The idea that her survival itself had drawn this danger to Jedediah's doorstep was a heavy burden. "But why? Why would they want me dead?" "Because you're a witness," Jedediah explained. "You saw them. You remember their faces. That makes you a threat to them. A loose end." He paused, his gaze steady. "And they don't like loose ends." The realization was chilling. Her mere existence had brought this violence to Jedediah's peaceful, albeit lonely existence. She had thought she was running from danger, but it seemed she had inadvertently led it to him. "I'm sorry, Jed," she murmured, her voice thick with guilt. Jedediah reached across the table, his rough hand covering hers. It was a gesture of comfort, but also of solidarity. "Don't be sorry," he said, his voice firm. "You did nothing wrong. You survived. That's all anyone can do. And now, we face this together. They might have brought the storm, but they'll find this ranch a hard place to break." He squeezed her hand. "And they'll find us even harder to break." The unseen hand of fate had brought them together, a lonely rancher haunted by his past and a young woman fleeing hers. The vultures, in their brutal attempt to erase a witness, had inadvertently created something unexpected, a united front, a hardened resolve, and a fragile but potent bond between two souls who had found solace and purpose in each other's company. The storm was gathering, but they were ready to stand against it together. The days following the vulture's attack settled into a tense, vigilant routine. Jedediah and Ilara worked tirelessly, rebuilding and fortifying their small corner of the world. The physical damage was being repaired, but the psychological toll remained. Ilara still suffered from nightmares, jolting awake in the dark, the phantom sounds of gunfire and screams echoing in her mind. Jedediah too found sleep elusive, the memory of his wife and son, and the new trauma of the vultures, a constant weight on his soul. Yet, amidst the hardship, a quiet strength grew between them. Jedediah taught Ilara more about the ranch, the cattle, the land. He shared his knowledge of survival, of tracking, of reading the subtle signs of the wilderness. Ilara, in turn, brought a spark of life back into the cabin, her quick mind absorbing Jedediah's lessons, her quiet presence a balm to his long-held solitude. She learned to mend fences with a proficiency that surprised him, to identify edible plants, and to handle a rifle with a steady, accurate hand. One crisp morning, as Jedediah was checking on the herd, he noticed a lone rider approaching in the distance. His hand instinctively went to the colt on his hip. The rider was too far to identify, but his approach was direct, purposeful, heading straight for the ranch. Caution was his watchword. "Ilara!" he called out, his voice carrying across the open fields. "Rider coming in. Stay inside. Keep the rifle ready." Ilara, who was feeding the chickens near the cabin, immediately dropped her bucket and hurried inside, securing the reinforced door behind her. She peeked through a narrow firing slit, her heart pounding. Jedediah was waiting, mounted on Black, his rifle held loosely but ready. As the rider drew closer, Jedediah recognized the worn leather and the familiar, albeit weathered, silhouette. It was Silas Croft, an old acquaintance, a man who, like Jedediah, had seen too much of the West's harshness. Silas was a trapper and occasional guide, a man who kept to himself, but was known for his integrity. Jedediah lowered his rifle, though his guard remained high. Silas reined in his horse a few yards from the cabin, his face etched with concern. "Jedediah," Silas called out, his voice raspy. "Heard there was trouble. Heard some varmints hit your place." Jedediah dismounted, approaching Silas cautiously. "Silas, good to see you, though I wish it were under better circumstances." He gestured towards the damaged palisade and the scarred cabin. "We had a disagreement with some of the vultures a few nights back." Silas's eyes widened with understanding and a grim recognition. "The vultures," he spat the name like a curse. "Nasty business. I heard whispers they were getting bolder. Didn't think they'd be hitting you." "They learn this isn't easy land to take," Jedediah replied, his gaze hardening. "But they'll be back, and they know I'm here now." Silas nodded, his gaze drifting towards the cabin, where Ilara's watchful eyes could be seen through the slit. "And you've got company, I see. Didn't think you were the type to take in strays, Jed." "She's no stray," Jedediah said, a touch of protectiveness in his voice. "She's Ilara. She survived the vultures. Came to my door near frozen. She's staying with me." Silas's eyebrows rose slightly. He knew Jedediah's reputation for solitude. "Well, I'll be. A young lady, huh? You've certainly picked an interesting time to get social." He turned his gaze back to Jedediah, his expression growing serious. "Jed, I came to warn you. Word is the vultures are planning a major raid. They're gathering men from all over. They lost their leader and a few good hands at your place. They're not going to let that stand. They want revenge, and they want to make an example of you." Jedediah's jaw tightened. He had expected as much. "How many are we talking about?" "Hard to say exactly, but enough to make a serious push. 50, maybe more. They're heading west, through this territory, looking to consolidate their hold, make sure no one crosses them. They're hitting every homestead, every small settlement they can find. They want to instill fear." Silas's voice was grim. "They see your ranch as a symbol of defiance. They want to crush it." The numbers sent a chill down Jedediah's spine. 50 men. It was an overwhelming force for him and Ilara. Their fortified cabin, their meager defenses, wouldn't hold against such numbers for long. "We can't fight that many," Ilara's voice, though strained, called out from inside the cabin, her ears having caught the hushed tones of their conversation. Silas looked towards the cabin, a hint of respect in his eyes. "She's right, Jed. You've done well defending yourself so far, but this is different. They're not playing games anymore." Jedediah looked at Ilara's hidden form, then back at Silas. He had spent 11 years in self-imposed exile, trying to outrun his own ghosts. Now those ghosts, amplified by new horrors, had returned, bringing with them a tangible, deadly threat. "What do you suggest, Silas?" Jedediah asked, his voice low. Silas shifted in his saddle. "I'm heading north, to Fort Carson. There's a small detachment of cavalry there. I can try to get word to them, convince them to send help, but it'll take time, days maybe, if they even believe me. The vultures are slippery." Jedediah considered this. Cavalry. It was their best hope, but a gamble. Time was not on their side. "And if they don't come?" Silas met his gaze, his expression somber. "Then you're on your own, and it won't be pretty." Ilara emerged from the cabin, her face pale but her eyes resolute. She had heard enough. "We can't just wait here to be overrun, Jed," she said, her voice firm. "If help isn't coming, we have to do something else. We have to fight smart." Jedediah looked at her, at the unwavering determination in her eyes. He saw the reflection of his own hardened spirit. They were no longer the terrified individuals who had met in this cabin. They were a unit, forged in fire, ready to face the impossible. "Silas," Jedediah said, his voice firm. "Ride. Go to Fort Carson. Tell them what you saw, what I told you. Tell them about the vultures. Give them my name. They know me. Tell them I'm holding out. But don't just rely on them. You know these lands. Is there anywhere else? Any other settlements? Anyone who might help?" Silas nodded. "There's a small mining camp a few days east, but they're mostly rough men looking out for themselves. Might be hard to convince them to risk their hides." "We have to try," Ilara interjected, her mind already working. "If they know the vultures are heading west, they might be motivated. They could be next." Jedediah looked at Ilara, a surge of respect for her quick thinking. She had a mind for strategy, a trait he hadn't expected. "You're right, Ilara. Silas, if you can, warn them too. Tell them the vultures are coming their way. Maybe they'll send some of their men to reinforce us, or at least be ready." Silas nodded, a plan beginning to form in his weathered mind. "It's a long shot, Jed, but I'll do what I can." He looked at the cabin, at the determined faces of Jedediah and Ilara. "You too. You're brave, but you're outnumbered. Be careful." With a final nod, Silas Croft turned his horse and rode off, disappearing into the vast expanse of the plains, a lone rider carrying a desperate plea. Jedediah and Ilara watched him go, the weight of their precarious situation settling heavily upon them. The shadow of the past had returned, not as ghosts but as a tangible, deadly force. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they were not defeated. Not yet. The unseen hand of fate had brought them together, and now they would face the gathering storm together, with a desperate, hardened resolve. The departure of Silas Croft left Jedediah and Ilara in a state of heightened anticipation. The knowledge that a force of 50 or more vultures was converging on their territory was a stark, terrifying reality. Their days were now consumed by a frantic effort to prepare for an inevitable onslaught. Every task, from mending tack to securing their dwindling food supplies, was imbued with a sense of urgency. Jedediah worked Ilara relentlessly, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. He knew that their best chance of survival lay in meticulous preparation and coordinated defense. He taught her to set rudimentary traps around the perimeter of the ranch, designed to slow down any approaching attackers and alert them to their presence. He reinforced the barn, turning it into a secondary defensive position, and stocked it with what little ammunition they had left. "They'll try to flank us," Jedediah explained, his voice low as he demonstrated how to camouflage a snare. "They won't just come straight for the cabin. They'll try to surround us, cut off our escape routes. We need to make them pay for every inch of ground." Ilara, though exhausted, absorbed his lessons with a grim determination. The fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now tempered by a steely resolve. She had faced death before, had stared into its cold eyes, and survived. She would not falter now. She remembered the faces of her family, the agony of their loss and the quiet strength of Jedediah. These memories fueled her, giving her the courage to face the overwhelming odds. "What about the cattle, Jed?" she asked one afternoon, as they worked to move the herd closer to the reinforced barn. "If they attack, they'll be exposed. We can't protect them all." Jedediah paused, leaning on his shovel, his gaze sweeping across the herd. "We'll have to try. But our priority is this ranch, our lives. We can't risk everything for the cattle. Some we'll have to let go." The words were spoken with a heavy heart. He had built this herd over years of hard labor, each animal a symbol of his survival, his resilience. But now survival meant making impossible choices. They spent hours moving the cattle, the lowing of the animals, a constant mournful soundtrack to their desperate efforts. Ilara discovered a surprising affinity for the livestock, her gentle touch and calm demeanor soothing the spooked animals. Jedediah watched her, a flicker of warmth in his eyes. She had a way with them, a connection that he, in his solitude, had long forgotten. As the days bled into one another, the landscape around them seemed to hold its breath. The vibrant greens of spring felt almost mocking, a stark contrast to the grim reality of their situation. Every distant sound, every shift in the wind, sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. The waiting was a torment, a slow erosion of their nerves. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the silence was broken by the distant whinny of a horse. Jedediah's head snapped up, his eyes narrowed. He moved to the window, peering out into the deepening twilight. "Someone's coming," he whispered, his voice taut. Ilara's heart leaped into her throat. The vultures. Too soon for them to be this close. Not with the traps. Jedediah's gaze was fixed on the approaching figure. "Silas?" The rider drew closer, and Jedediah's suspicion was confirmed. It was Silas Croft, his horse lathered, his face grim. He reined in his mount, dismounting with a weary sigh. "Jedediah," Silas began, his voice strained. "Bad news. The mining camp. They're not coming. They said they have their own problems to worry about. And the cavalry. I reached Fort Carson. They say they can't spare anyone. Too many other threats, too few men. They offered to send a scout patrol in a week, maybe." "A week, Jedediah." Silas spat the words out in frustration. Jedediah's jaw tightened, a cold fury simmering beneath his calm exterior. A week. By then, it would be too late. "So, we're on our own," he stated, the words heavy with grim resignation. Ilara's face fell. Hope, fragile as it was, had been extinguished. The weight of their isolation pressed down on her heavier than ever. "I tried, Jed," Silas said, his voice heavy with regret. "I really did. But they're all looking out for themselves. The vultures have them scared. Scared enough to ignore pleas for help." Jedediah nodded slowly, his gaze distant. He had always known the West was a cruel, unforgiving place, where self-reliance was the only true law. But this was a stark reminder of how truly alone they were. "What about your own supplies, Silas?" Jedediah asked, changing the subject. "You always keep a good stock." Silas looked surprised by the question, but then understanding dawned. He met Jedediah's gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "I can spare some," Silas said. "A little extra ammunition, some dried meat. Not much, but it's something." "Thank you, Silas," Ilara said, her voice soft. "That means more than you know." Silas shrugged, his weathered face etched with concern. "You two are all that's left of what's decent out here. I can't stand by and watch you get overrun. But this is a fight you might not win." Jedediah met Silas's gaze, his own eyes hard and resolute. "We'll do what we can, Silas. We've got this ranch, we've got each other, and we've got grit. That's more than they have." He looked towards the east, where the faintest trace of smoke still lingered on the horizon. "The sands of time are running out, but we're not done fighting yet." The unspoken message was clear. They would stand their ground, no matter the odds. The vultures were coming, and they would be met with a desperate, hardened resistance. The days following Silas Croft's grim report were marked by a palpable tension. The hope of external aid had been extinguished, leaving Jedediah and Ilara with the cold, hard reality of their isolation. The ranch, once a place of solitary peace, had become a fortress under siege, its inhabitants acutely aware of the gathering storm. Jedediah, a man who had long since learned to rely only on himself, found a new strength in Ilara's unwavering resilience. Her determination, forged in the fires of her own past tragedy, mirrored his own hardened resolve. They worked in tandem, each task imbued with the urgency of impending conflict. They reinforced the cabin's structure further, turning narrow window openings into strategic firing positions. They dug deeper trenches, camouflaging them with brush and dried grass, creating deadly traps for any who dared to approach. Ilara, no longer the frail girl who had stumbled onto Jedediah's doorstep, moved with a newfound purpose. Her hands, once delicate, were now calloused and strong. She practiced with the rifles, her aim growing steadier with each passing day, her focus sharp and unwavering. She learned to anticipate Jedediah's needs, to read his unspoken commands, their communication a silent ballet of survival. "They'll probe first," Jedediah said one evening, as they shared a meager meal of dried venison and beans. His gaze was fixed on the distant horizon, as if he could see the enemy approaching. "They won't come in full force right away. They'll send scouts, try to draw us out, see how we react." "And what do we do?" Ilara asked, her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "We wait," Jedediah replied. "We let them come to us. We use the traps. We make them pay for every step they take onto this land. We make them think twice before they commit their full force." His eyes, faded blue and etched with the weariness of years, held a grim determination. "We make them regret they ever came here." The following morning dawned under a sky of oppressive grey. The air was still, heavy with the scent of impending rain, and a palpable sense of unease hung over the ranch. Jedediah and Ilara took their positions, Jedediah on the roof of the cabin, Ilara in the reinforced position by the front window. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the sparse grasses. Hours passed. The sun, hidden behind the thick clouds, offered little warmth. The waiting was a test of nerves, a slow, agonizing erosion of patience. Ilara's hands tightened on the rifle, her knuckles white. She focused on her breathing, on the steady rhythm of her own heart, trying to push back the encroaching fear. Then a sound, faint at first, a rustle in the distance, barely audible above the wind. Jedediah's head snapped up. He scanned the horizon, his eyes sharp, unwavering. "Movement," he whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. "North. 2 riders. Coming in low, using the gullies for cover." Ilara's breath hitched. The first strike. The probing attack. "They're heading for the eastern edge of the property," Jedediah continued, his voice calm, measured. "Where we set the snares. Let them come. Let them see what awaits them." The 2 riders, barely visible against the muted landscape, moved with a practiced stealth. They were vultures, their predatory movements unmistakable. They skirted the main ranch buildings, heading towards the more remote sections of the property, exactly as Jedediah had predicted. Suddenly a sharp cry, a panicked whinny. One of the riders' horses stumbled, yelping in pain. A trap, Jedediah's traps. The rider dismounted quickly, his partner following suit. They moved cautiously towards the injured animal, their movements betraying a growing unease. Jedediah watched, his finger resting lightly on the trigger of his rifle. He would let them come closer, make them feel vulnerable. The injured horse thrashed, its leg caught in a cleverly concealed wire snare. The 2 vultures circled it warily, their weapons drawn. They were exposed, silhouetted against the grey sky. "Now," Jedediah murmured. He squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed across the plains, a sharp, decisive crack that shattered the tense silence. One of the vultures staggered, clutching his arm, dropping his rifle. His partner reacted instantly, firing wildly in the direction of the shot, his bullets kicking up dust far from Jedediah's position. Clara, hearing Jedediah's shot, reacted instantly. She sighted her own rifle through the slit in the cabin window. Her target, the second rider, who was now trying to help his wounded comrade. Her aim was true. She squeezed the trigger. A choked gasp, and the second rider fell, his rifle clattering to the ground. Jedediah watched, his expression unreadable. Ilara's shot had been clean, precise. She had held her nerve. He lowered his rifle, a grim satisfaction settling over him. The first strike had been met, and repelled. "2 down," Jedediah called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "The rest of you can come and collect your dead, if you dare." Silence answered him. The remaining vultures, if there were any still concealed, had melted back into the landscape. Jedediah scanned the horizon, but saw nothing. They had retreated, their probing attack repulsed. He climbed down from the roof, his movements deliberate. Ilara emerged from the cabin, her face pale but her eyes bright with a mixture of fear and triumph. "You did good, Ilara," Jedediah said, his voice rough with admiration. "Real good." She nodded, still trembling slightly, but her gaze met his with a newfound confidence. "They underestimated us, Jed." "They did," he agreed, looking out at the fallen vultures, stark against the grey earth. "And they'll pay for it." He knew this was only the beginning. The vultures would not give up so easily. They had been wounded. Their pride stung. Their next move would be more calculated, more brutal. But for now they had held. They had struck back. And in doing so, they had proven that this ranch, this small patch of land, was not an easy target. It was a place defended by 2 souls who had found a reason to fight, a reason to live together. The first strike had been met, and the sands of time were indeed running out, but they had bought themselves precious time. The aftermath of the brief, sharp skirmish left Jedediah and Ilara in a state of heightened awareness. The 2 vultures Jedediah had shot were dead, their bodies a grim testament to the ranch's defenses. The wounded one Elara had brought down was also dead. Their probing attack had been decisively repelled, but the victory was a hollow one, laced with the chilling certainty that this was only a prelude. Jedediah, with Elara's quiet assistance, dragged the bodies to the ravine. The task was becoming tragically routine. As he worked, his mind raced, piecing together the fragments of information. 2 scouts. They were likely part of a larger group, assessing Jedediah's defenses, perhaps searching for a weakness. The fact that they had come from the eastern edge of the property suggested the main vulture force was positioned in that direction, keeping a watchful eye. "They know we're here, Jed," Elara said softly, her voice tinged with weariness as they covered the last of the bodies with earth. "They know we fought back." "They do," Jedediah confirmed, his gaze sweeping the horizon. "And they won't like it. They'll be angry. They'll be planning something worse." He looked at her, his faded blue eyes holding a grim resolve. "We need to assume they're watching us constantly now. Every move we make." They returned to the cabin, the reinforced structure offering a fragile sense of security. Jedediah reinforced the firing slits, ensuring they offered maximum visibility with minimum exposure. Elara spent hours meticulously cleaning their weapons, her movements precise and economical, a stark contrast to the frantic energy of the previous engagement. "We need to conserve our ammunition," Jedediah stated, laying out their meager supply. "Every shot counts. We can't afford to waste any." He looked at the small pile of bullets, a lump forming in his throat. It was nowhere near enough if a full-scale assault came. Elara nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. "We'll use the traps, and we'll use the terrain. We make them come to us one by one if we can." The following days were a torturous exercise in patience and vigilance. Jedediah spent hours on the roof, his gaze perpetually scanning the horizon, his senses alert for any sign of movement. Elara, though confined mostly to the cabin, kept a watchful eye through the firing slits, her ears straining for the faintest sound. The wind, once a mournful companion, now seemed to carry whispers of threat, every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call, sending a jolt of adrenaline through them. They saw no sign of the vultures, no visible riders, but the absence of activity was more unnerving than an overt threat. It suggested a patient enemy, a calculating force gathering its strength, waiting for the opportune moment. It was the calm before the true storm. One afternoon, as Jedediah was checking the western perimeter, he found more tracks. Not just a few scouts, but evidence of a larger presence. Multiple sets of boot prints and the faint but unmistakable signs of horses being tethered. They had been closer than he thought, perhaps observing their repairs, their routine. The vultures were circling, patient predators assessing their prey. He returned to the cabin, his mind racing. "They're closer than we thought," he told Elara, his voice low and serious. "They've been watching us, assessing our defenses." He looked at the reinforced cabin, the sturdy palisade. "They know we're not easy targets, but they also know we're outnumbered. They'll be waiting for us to make a mistake, or they'll try to draw us out." "What if we tried to draw them out?" Elara suggested, her mind working rapidly. "What if we made them think we were vulnerable? Lead them into a trap?" Jedediah considered her proposal. It was risky, but it might be their only chance to thin their numbers before a full assault. "It's a dangerous gamble, Elara, if they see through it. But if they don't," she countered, her eyes shining with a fierce determination. "We have the traps. We have the terrain. We can make them pay for every step they take." Jedediah looked at her, at the courage that burned in her eyes, a courage that had been forged in the fires of her own past. He saw not just the young woman he had saved, but a warrior, a survivor. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that she was right. They couldn't just wait to be attacked. They had to take some initiative, however small. "All right," Jedediah said, a grim smile touching his lips. "Let's give them something to think about. But we do it my way. We use deception. We make them believe they have the upper hand." Their plan was simple yet perilous. Jedediah would ride out, making a show of checking the northern pastures, a feigned vulnerability. He would leave Elara alone at the ranch, a seemingly easy target. The vultures, likely observing, would see an opportunity. They would send scouts, perhaps even a small group, to try and overwhelm her, to see if they could force a quick victory. Elara, using the reinforced cabin and the strategically placed traps, would have to hold them off until Jedediah could return. hopefully having lured some of their forces away from the main camp. "You can do this, Ilara," Jedediah said, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You're stronger than you think. Just remember what we practiced. Don't engage unless you have to. Use the traps. Make them pay." Ilara nodded, her face pale but her eyes steady. "I'll be ready, Jed. Just come back. Come back safe." Jedediah met her gaze, a silent promise passing between them. He mounted Black, a final look of concern for Ilara, then rode off, his silhouette quickly swallowed by the vastness of the plains. Ilara watched him go, her heart a tight knot of fear and anticipation. The vultures were circling, patient and deadly, and now the game had begun. The first strike had been repelled, but the circling predators were closing in, and the real fight for survival was about to commence. Jedediah rode with a practiced calm, his movements betraying none of the tension that simmered beneath his surface. He moved north, towards the pastures that bordered the foothills, his gaze constantly sweeping the terrain. He knew he was being watched. He could feel the invisible eyes of the vultures on him, assessing his every move, waiting for him to make a mistake. He deliberately rode slower than usual, making his herd check appear less urgent. He let Black graze leisurely, his own posture relaxed, almost nonchalant. He wanted them to see him as vulnerable, as a lone rancher, isolated and easy prey. He wanted them to believe their plan, the one he had subtly orchestrated, was working. He reached the northernmost fence line, a dilapidated structure that offered little real protection. He dismounted, pretending to inspect a broken post, his rifle leaning against the fence, easily within reach. He even allowed himself a moment to sit on the ground, a picture of a man weary from his solitary labor. He waited. The sun climbed higher, its warmth doing little to dispel the chill of apprehension. He could hear the faint chirping of birds, the distant bleating of a few stray sheep. But beneath it all he listened for the subtler sounds, the rustle of movement, the unnatural stillness of the wind. Then he saw it, a faint shimmer in the heat haze, a distortion in the distant landscape. Riders, two of them initially moving with caution, using the sparse cover of the sagebrush. They were scouts, just as he had anticipated, sent to confirm his perceived vulnerability. Jedediah remained still, his heart beating a steady rhythm against his ribs. He let them approach, his hand resting casually on his rifle. He wanted them close enough to see his relaxed posture, his apparent lack of concern, close enough to believe their prey was within their grasp. When they were about 100 yards away, Jedediah slowly rose, stretching as if to relieve a cramp. He casually picked up his rifle, holding it loosely, not in a threatening manner. He let out a low whistle, a signal to Black, who ambled over to him. The two scouts exchanged a look, their intentions clear. They saw an easy target, a lone man distracted. They spurred their horses forward, their rifles raised. Jedediah waited until they were within 50 yards. Then, with a sudden burst of speed, he swung himself into Black's saddle. He didn't fire immediately. He let them see his surprise, his feigned panic. He turned Black, galloping back towards the ranch, his pace exaggeratedly fast, as if fleeing in terror. The vultures followed, their shouts of triumph carried on the wind. They were confident, overconfident. They saw him running, and they believed their trap, their deception, was working. As Jedediah rode, he subtly guided Black towards a predetermined position, a shallow ravine that overlooked the main trail leading to the ranch. He had set several of his most potent traps along this route, designed to injure horses and disrupt the attackers. The vultures, blinded by their eagerness, rode straight into them. The first horse stumbled, yelping in pain as its forelegs snapped in a hidden pitfall. The rider was thrown, landing hard. His companion, momentarily distracted, slowed his pace. This was Jedediah's chance. He wheeled Black around, bringing his rifle to bear. He didn't hesitate. He fired twice, quickly and precisely. The first shot found its mark, dropping one vulture from his saddle. The second rider, startled and vulnerable, tried to turn his horse, but Jedediah was already reloading. He fired again, a clean shot that brought the second rider down. He didn't linger. He knew more would be coming. He spurred Black onward, galloping back towards the ranch, his heart pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and grim satisfaction. He had lured them, trapped them, and eliminated the immediate threat. Now it was Ilara's turn. Ilara watched from the cabin, her breath held tight in her chest. She had seen Jedediah ride out, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. She had seen the two riders follow him, their approach aggressive and confident. When she heard the distant shouts, the crack of rifle fire, her heart leaped. She saw Jedediah's signal, a series of quick whistles, and knew it was time. She grabbed the shotgun, her hands steady, despite the tremor that ran through her. She moved to her designated position, the reinforced window overlooking the main approach to the cabin. She waited, her senses on high alert. She could hear the thundering of hooves, closer now. More riders. Not two, but at least 5, their shouts growing louder, their intent clear. They were following Jedediah's supposed escape route, believing they were closing in on their prey. Ilara took a deep breath, focusing her mind. She remembered Jedediah's words, "Make them pay for every step." As the lead rider, a burly man with a scarred face Jedediah had described as Scarface, a known lieutenant of the Vultures, crested the rise. Ilara fired. The shotgun roared, a deafening blast in the quiet morning. The lead horse stumbled, throwing its rider. Chaos erupted. The other riders, momentarily stunned, spurred their horses forward, intent on reaching the cabin. But Jedediah's traps had done their work. Another horse went down, its rider thrown. 2 more vultures were separated from the main group, their advance disrupted. Ilara reloaded quickly, her movements fluid and practiced. She sighted on the next rider, a wiry man with shifty eyes. She fired again. He slumped in his saddle, his horse veering erratically. She heard Jedediah's distant shouts, his rifle fire. He was drawing their attention, drawing some of them away. But it was a dangerous gamble. She was alone now, facing the remaining vultures, their fury no doubt intensified by the losses they had already sustained. The deception had worked, but the cost was immense. The first strike had been met with a calculated counter, but the circling vultures were far from defeated. They were enraged, and they were still numerous. Ilara, alone in the cabin, the shotgun heavy in her hands, knew the true battle had just begun. The echoes of Ilara's shotgun blasts faded, replaced by a chilling silence that was more unnerving than any gunfire. Jedediah, having successfully lured away a significant portion of the vulture force with his feigned retreat and well-placed traps, raced back towards the ranch. He had accounted for 3 riders in his escape, confident that the deception had drawn enough of them away to give Ilara a fighting chance. But now, approaching the ranch, he could hear the unmistakable sounds of combat. He spurred Black to a furious gallop, his heart pounding with a grim mix of urgency and fear. As he crested the final rise, the scene that greeted him stole his breath. Ilara's cabin, once a symbol of his hard-won solitude, was now the focal point of a desperate struggle. Several horses lay injured or dead in the yard, their riders scattered. Ilara, silhouetted in the firing slit of the cabin, her rifle steadily firing, was a beacon of defiance. Jedediah didn't hesitate. He saw the remaining vultures, no more than 4 or 5, regrouping, their initial shock giving way to enraged fury. They were concentrating their fire on the cabin, their bullets pinging off the reinforced wood. "Ilara!" Jedediah roared, his voice raw with desperation as he charged into the fray. He drew his Colt, firing rapidly at the nearest vulture, forcing him to break off his attack on the cabin. The sudden arrival of Jedediah threw the vultures into disarray. Caught between his attack and Ilara's steady fire from the cabin, they were suddenly on the defensive. "They're trying to draw us out!" Jedediah shouted to Ilara, though he knew she was focused on survival. "Don't leave the cabin, not unless you have to." He engaged the remaining vultures, his movements swift and brutal. He was a whirlwind of controlled aggression, his rifle spitting fire, his Colt a deadly extension of his will. He fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal, fueled by years of suppressed rage and the primal instinct to protect. One vulture, a burly man with a scarred face, Jedediah recognized him from Ilara's description as Scarface, one of the lieutenants. He was a formidable opponent, his movements swift and brutal. He dodged Jedediah's initial attack, his own rifle spitting fire. Jedediah felt a searing pain in his left arm as a bullet grazed him, but he pushed through the agony, his focus solely on survival. He ducked behind a fallen horse, reloading his Colt with practiced speed. Meanwhile, Ilara, witnessing Jedediah's desperate struggle, knew she couldn't stay hidden. Her training, her courage, her burgeoning instinct for battle surged within her. Jedediah was outnumbered, injured, and fighting for his life. She couldn't let him face them alone. She took a deep breath, checked the chamber of her shotgun, and kicked open the reinforced cabin door. The sudden opening, the sight of the young woman emerging, armed and ready, momentarily stunned the vultures. "Get away from him!" Ilara yelled, her voice ringing with a ferocity that belied her youth. She leveled the shotgun at Scarface, who had Jedediah pinned down. Scarface turned, his eyes narrowing in disbelief and rage. He had seen her, the girl, but hadn't expected her to emerge. He raised his rifle, but Ilara was faster. She squeezed the trigger. The blast echoed across the yard, and Scarface staggered back, dropping his rifle. He clutched his chest, his eyes wide with shock, then crumpled to the ground. Jedediah, seizing the opportunity, surged forward, his Colt firing a rapid burst at the remaining two vultures. They turned, their faces a mask of fear and desperation, and spurred their horses away from the ranch, disappearing into the vastness of the plains. Silence descended once more, broken only by the labored breaths of Jedediah and Ilara and the pained whinnies of injured horses. The yard was littered with fallen vultures, a grim tableau of their failed assault. Jedediah, his arm bleeding, stumbled towards Ilara, his gaze filled with a mixture of relief and awe. You did it, Ilara," he rasped, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved me." Ilara looked at him, her own face streaked with dirt and sweat, her eyes wide but clear. "We saved each other, Jed." She rushed to his side, helping him lean against the cabin wall. She saw the blood seeping through his shirt, the grimace of pain on his face. "Your arm," she whispered, her hands trembling as she reached for it. "It's just a graze," Jedediah said, though his voice was strained. "We need to finish this. We need to make sure they don't come back, not tonight anyway." He looked towards the direction the remaining vultures had fled. He knew this was not the end. This was merely the beginning of the siege. They had repelled the first wave, but the vultures, wounded and enraged, would regroup. They would be back, and they would come in greater numbers, more determined than ever to break their spirit, to claim their revenge. The siege had begun, and Jedediah and Ilara, two souls bound by shared trauma and a desperate will to survive, were ready to face it together. The immediate aftermath of the skirmish was a surreal mix of relief and grim necessity. Jedediah, despite the searing pain in his arm, moved with a determined urgency. Ilara, though still trembling from the adrenaline and the shock of combat, had found a new reservoir of strength. She helped Jedediah bind his wound with strips of clean cloth, her touch surprisingly steady. "We need to secure the perimeter again," Jedediah grunted, his face pale with pain. "They'll be back, and they'll be angrier." They worked in silence, their movements efficient, their minds focused on survival. They collected the weapons of the fallen vultures, adding them to their meager arsenal. They salvaged what they could from the downed horses, ensuring no useful supplies were wasted. Every action was a small act of defiance against the overwhelming force that still lurked in the distance. As the sun began to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the ravaged yard, Jedediah and Ilara surveyed their work. The cabin stood battered but unbowed. The palisade, though damaged, still offered some protection. Several vultures lay dead, their threat neutralized at least for now, but the victory felt heavy, burdened by the knowledge of what was to come. "They'll be back," Ilara said, her voice quiet, echoing Jedediah's earlier assessment. "They won't give up." "No," Jedediah agreed, leaning against the cabin wall, his injured arm throbbing. "They won't. They lost men, and they lost face. They'll want to make us pay. They'll come with more. They'll come with everything they have." He looked at Ilara, at the exhaustion etched on her young face, but also at the unwavering resolve in her eyes. She had faced death and emerged stronger, a warrior forged in the crucible of conflict. He felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for her courage but for her presence. His 11 years of solitude had ended, not with a whimper, but with a roar, and he was no longer alone in his fight. "We did good, Ilara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Real good. You saved me today. You saved this ranch." Ilara offered a small, weary smile. "We saved each other, Jed. We're a team now." The weight of their shared victory settled upon them. It was a victory hard won, bought with blood and courage, but it was also a victory that underscored their precarious situation. They had won a battle, but the war was far from over. The vultures, a ruthless and vengeful gang, would not be deterred by a single defeat. They spent the night in a state of heightened vigilance, taking turns on watch. The silence of the night was punctuated by the rustle of the wind and the distant cries of unseen animals. Every sound was amplified, every shadow seemed to conceal a threat. Sleep offered little respite. Ilara's dreams filled with the faces of the fallen, Jedediah's haunted by the ghosts of his past and the looming spectre of the vultures. The following morning dawned under a sky of bruised purple and grey, mirroring the somber mood that settled over the ranch. The threat had not diminished, only shifted. Jedediah, despite his injured arm, continued to supervise the repairs, his focus unwavering. Ilara worked alongside him, her movements efficient, her mind already anticipating their next move. "We need to conserve our supplies," Jedediah stated, his gaze sweeping over their dwindling stores of food and ammunition. "Silas gave us what he could, but it won't last forever. We need to ration everything." Ilara nodded, already calculating. "We'll need to be careful with every shot. Every bullet is precious." They spent the day reinforcing the barn, turning it into a secondary defensive position. Jedediah knew that if the vultures managed to breach the cabin's defenses, the barn would be their last stand. He moved the remaining cattle into the relative safety of the barn, a desperate attempt to protect what little they had left. As dusk settled, a new sound reached their ears, faint at first, then growing steadily louder. It was the sound of horses, many horses. Jedediah and Ilara exchanged a grim look. The vultures were back, and this time they had come in force. The siege had truly begun. Jedediah picked up his rifle, his injured arm throbbing. Ilara grabbed her shotgun, her face pale but her eyes resolute. They stood side by side, a united front against the encroaching darkness. "Ready?" Jedediah asked, his voice low. Ilara met his gaze, her own eyes burning with a fierce determination. "Ready," she replied. The weight of their victory was heavy, but it had also forged them into something new. They were no longer just a lone rancher and a lost girl. They were survivors, bound by a shared ordeal, ready to face the overwhelming odds. The vultures had come for them, and they would be met not with fear, but with a hardened resolve, a desperate courage born of necessity. The siege had begun, and they would fight with everything they had together. The thundering of hooves grew louder, an ominous drumbeat signaling the arrival of the vultures. Jedediah and Ilara stood their ground, their faces grim, their resolve hardened by the recent skirmish and the grim knowledge of their outnumbered state. Jedediah, despite his injured arm, held his rifle steady, his gaze fixed on the approaching riders. Ilara stood beside him, shotgun loaded, her eyes scanning the yard, her breath coming in shallow, controlled bursts. The vultures, perhaps 20 or more, emerged from the twilight, a dark tide of menace against the backdrop of the setting sun. They were led by Scarface's presumed replacement, a lean, cruel-looking man with cold, calculating eyes. Jedediah recognized him from Silas's descriptions, a ruthless individual known for his brutality. "They're back," Jedediah stated, his voice low, devoid of emotion, "and they've brought friends." Ilara nodded, her grip tightening on the shotgun. The sheer number of them was daunting. The traps they had set, the reinforced cabin, they had bought them time, but against such a force, it felt like a desperate gamble. "We stick to the plan," Jedediah said, his eyes never leaving the approaching riders. "We use the cabin, we use the barn, we make them pay for every inch. We don't engage unless we have to, we conserve ammunition, we wait for an opening." The vultures didn't charge headlong this time. They fanned out, cautiously approaching the fortified ranch, their movements a clear indication that they had learned from their previous costly mistakes. They knew this wouldn't be an easy victory. The leader, a man Jedediah now recognized as the Serpent due to his cunning reputation, reined in his horse at the edge of the yard, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Stone!" he yelled, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "You think you can stop us? You killed good men. Your time is up." Jedediah didn't respond, his gaze steady, unwavering. He wouldn't be drawn into a verbal exchange, wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. The Serpent gestured to his men. A few vultures peeled off, heading towards the barn, clearly intending to cut off their escape route and eliminate the cattle. Others began circling the cabin, their rifles spitting fire, the bullets pinging harmlessly against the reinforced wood and sodden earth. "They're going for the barn," Ilara said, her voice tight with concern. "The cattle, let them go," Jedediah said grimly. Our priority is the cabin. If they get inside, we're finished. We hold the cabin. You cover the front. I'll take the side." Jedediah moved to a fortified window on the side of the cabin, his rifle aimed. Ilara remained at the front, her shotgun ready. The gauntlet had been thrown down. The siege was in full, brutal effect. The vultures began their assault in earnest. They advanced slowly, deliberately, firing volleys at the cabin, trying to wear down its defenses. Jedediah and Ilara responded with carefully aimed shots, conserving their ammunition, making every bullet count. Jedediah's injured arm throbbed with each shot, but he pushed through the pain, his focus absolute. One vulture attempting to rush the front of the cabin was brought down by Ilara's precise shot. Another, trying to flank Jedediah's position, met a similar fate. But for every vulture they felled, more seemed to emerge from the circling ranks. "They're trying to draw us out," Jedediah grunted, reloading his rifle. "Don't fall for it, Ilara. We stay inside. We make them come to us." The vultures, frustrated by the cabin's resilience, began to change tactics. They started setting fires, attempting to smoke Jedediah and Ilara out. Small fires, strategically placed, began to spread across the dry grass surrounding the cabin. "They're trying to burn us out," Ilara cried, a plume of smoke visible near the side of the cabin. Jedediah swore under his breath. This was a dangerous tactic. If the fire reached the cabin, their defenses would be compromised. "We need water," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "The barrels by the back door." While Jedediah continued to provide covering fire, Ilara, with surprising speed and agility, dashed to the back of the cabin, grabbing buckets and filling them from the water barrels. She worked with a frantic urgency, dousing the flames before they could engulf the structure. It was a dangerous dance, a desperate race against time, with bullets whizzing past her. The vultures, seeing their tactic of fire being thwarted, shifted their approach once more. They began to advance in a more concentrated wave, intent on overwhelming Jedediah and Ilara with sheer numbers. They were closing in, their taunts and curses filling the air. Jedediah and Ilara fought back with everything they had, their shots precise, deadly. They were a well-oiled machine, their movements coordinated, their shared experience in the previous fight making them a formidable duo. But they were tiring. Their ammunition was dwindling. The sheer pressure of the assault was taking its toll. As the vultures pressed their attack, Jedediah saw his chance. The serpent, leading the charge, momentarily exposed himself. Jedediah sighted his rifle, his injured arm forgotten. He squeezed the trigger. The serpent cried out, stumbling in his saddle, his attack faltering. This was the opening they needed. "Now!" Jedediah yelled, his voice raw. "We make our move!" With a surge of adrenaline, Jedediah kicked open the front door. Ilara closed behind him, shotgun raised. They burst out into the yard, into the midst of the chaos, determined to break the siege, to fight their way out of the gauntlet. The fight for their survival had reached its desperate, brutal climax. Jedediah and Ilara burst from the burning cabin, turning their desperate flight into a fierce counterattack. The vultures, caught completely off guard, faltered. Jedediah, fueled by adrenaline, fired his rifle with a ferocity that belied his injured arm, while Ilara's shotgun provided deadly close-range support. The serpent, though wounded, roared in rage and tried to rally his men, but his control was slipping. Fighting their way to the barn, Jedediah and Ilara slammed the heavy doors shut behind them. The dusty air was thick with their ragged breaths and the nervous lowing of the cattle. Jedediah, his injured arm throbbing, leaned against the door. "We made it," he rasped. "For now. They'll try to breach the barn next," Ilara said, her eyes wide with exhaustion, but holding a defiant spark. "They know we're trapped." Jedediah took stock of their surroundings. The barn was a better fortress than the burning cabin, but it was still vulnerable, with more openings and a constant fire hazard from the hay. "We make our stand here," he stated, his voice firm. "We make them fight for every inch. We've got ammunition for a few more volleys. We make them count." Outside, the vultures began their assault, firing volleys and trying to set the barn ablaze. Ilara, with surprising strength, grabbed buckets of water and began dousing the hay while Jedediah fired through small openings, picking off any who got too close. The battle raged, a whirlwind of bullets and panicked animals, but they held their ground. Suddenly, a distant sound cut through the chaos, the unmistakable thundering of cavalry hooves. Jedediah's heart soared as he recognized the sound. "Silas! Cavalry! They're here!" he yelled. Panic swept through the vultures' ranks. They knew the cavalry meant the end. The serpent, seeing his men break, roared in fury, but it was too late. The cavalry, led by Silas Croft, charged into the fray, a whirlwind of steel and fury. The vultures were quickly overwhelmed and scattered into the night, their reign of terror broken. Jedediah watched them flee, exhausted but triumphant. He looked at Ilara, a profound respect in his eyes. "We did it, Ilara," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. Ilara met his gaze, a shaky smile on her lips as tears of exhaustion and relief streamed down her face. "We did, Jed," she replied. "We did." The aftermath of the raid was a scene of grim devastation. Bullet holes scarred the cabin and barn, the palisade was tattered, and the yard was littered with the debris of battle. Silas Croft, grim but resolute, oversaw the cavalry's efforts. He found Jedediah, his arm bandaged, leaning against the barn with a weary expression. Ilara was nearby, gently tending to a frightened calf. "You held them off, Jedediah," Silas said, a rare note of admiration in his voice. "I'm sorry we couldn't get here sooner." "You got here when it counted," Jedediah replied, glancing at Ilara. "She fought like a lioness, saved my life." Silas looked at Ilara, seeing not a victim but a survivor. "You've got grit, young lady," he said with a genuine smile. Ilara returned his smile. "I had good teachers." Over the next few days, the cavalry helped with repairs and hunted down the remaining vultures. The serpent was among the fallen, and the gang was broken. Though the physical wounds healed, both Jedediah and Ilara carried the invisible scars of the battle. The confrontation had brought back the ghosts of Jedediah's past, but this time he hadn't been alone. Ilara, too, was changed. The terrified, starving girl was replaced by a young woman who had faced her deepest fears and emerged unbroken. As the cavalry prepared to depart, Silas approached them. "The vultures are scattered," he said. "You're safe now, for the foreseeable future at least." "What happens now?" Ilara asked, her gaze shifting from Silas to Jedediah. The question, unspoken for so long, hung in the air. Jedediah looked at her, his haunted weariness replaced by a new light. "We rebuild," he said, his voice firm. "We make this ranch whole again, and we go on." He didn't elaborate, but Ilara understood. Their shared ordeal had forged an unbreakable bond. They were no longer a solitary man and a lone survivor. They were Jedediah and Ilara, partners, ready to face whatever the future held together. The weeks that followed were a time of healing and rebuilding. The ranch slowly regained its life, and Jedediah began to emerge from the shadows of his past. He found a renewed purpose in rebuilding his home, and Ilara, in turn, flourished under his guidance. Her laughter, once a rare sound, now echoed through the cabin. One morning, as they surveyed the newly repaired fences, Ilara turned to Jedediah. "Silas said the threat is gone," she began. "Then, what do we do now?" Jedediah met her gaze, a quiet understanding passing between them. His 11 years of solitude had been a self-imposed exile, but Ilara had shattered that isolation. "We have a ranch to rebuild," he said, his voice steady. "A life to build. We can make this place a home. Together." Ilara's heart soared. The word home resonated deeply, a balm to the lingering emptiness of her past. "I'd like that, Jed," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. They spent the summer working, their days filled with the rhythm of ranch life. Ilara discovered a talent for cultivating the land, and Jedediah watched her with quiet pride. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Jedediah spoke thoughtfully. "The world is a big place, Ilara. You could go anywhere. Start fresh." Ilara's blue eyes were steady. "I don't want to go anywhere," she said simply. "This is where I want to be. This is my home now. And you're my family." Jedediah's heart swelled. He reached across the table, his calloused hand covering hers. "And you're mine, Ilara," he said, his voice thick with unspoken emotion. "You always will be." As autumn arrived, Jedediah and Ilara stood on the porch of their rebuilt cabin, looking out at the vast Montana plains. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer defined them. They were survivors, partners, a family. The future stretched before them, an unknown horizon filled with possibilities. They would face it together, two souls who had found each other in the wilderness, ready to build a new life, a new home on the foundations of courage, resilience, and an enduring, unbreakable bond.